Clipper Audio presents an unabridged recording of The Bee and the Orange Tree by Melissa Ashley, narrated by Anna Bentinck. As soon as a woman lives separated from her husband, she gives out arms against herself, and it is not thought to offend her to suspect her conduct. Memoirs of the Countess D. by Henriette Julie de Murat. Prologue. Nicola, 30th of March, 1699. The fortune-teller, Madame Lagasse, rented rooms in the attic of a 3-story wattle and daub house. Pigeons in the eaves, buckled lime-washed walls, and exposed beams that threatened injury from every angle. "My skin prickles," whispered Nicola Tiquet. "Be calm," advised her companion, Marthe de Senonville. "You'll enjoy it." Marthe's terrier, Puck, was busy at her feet, sniffing the floorboards. Gathering him up, she deposited the dog into Nicola's arms. "Here, give him a little stroke." Warily she accepted the attention of Marthe's excitable pet, smiling despite herself as he fussily arranged himself on her lap and leapt up to lick her neck. The waiting-room window offered Nicola a view of the narrow laneway below, where a hodgepodge market of quacks was selling all manner of miracle cures, unguents that dissolved wrinkles, compresses for leprosy and distemper, tinctures to sharpen wits, bewitchments to wither the virility of a former lover. At the shout of a police lieutenant, the begging orphans, oiled confidence men and bartering tarts ran hither and thither like chickens alert to a fox in their coop, dispersing in a flurry of dropped wares and curses. When her dear friend had collected her that morning, Nicola had been determined to enjoy the diversion, absorbing the swirling street life of her Saint-Germain neighbourhood. But as the open-topped carriage had approached Ile de la Cité, she had clutched Marthe's arm in discomfort. Crossing the Seine's bridges, not once but twice, she tightened her grip. Soon the broad avenues and carved stone facades were well behind them. Arriving at their destination, she had stepped gingerly behind Marthe, down the coach's tiny stairs, reluctantly setting her foot on this crowded, smelly laneway in the Marais. They were not the only customers. The door of the waiting-room opened, and a gargantuan fellow, stooping low to avoid a ceiling joist, ducked inside. He held the hand of a young boy, dressed in a blue silk jacket and breeches, the same shade of blue worn by a clerk in the civil courts. The shade of blue Claude wore. Nicola returned Puck to Marthe and closed her eyes, breathing as deeply as her tight stays allowed, determined not to look at the boy. She was too weary for such thoughts. Her bottle of sleeping draught empty, she had spent a long night changing positions beneath the heavy covers of her canopied bed. She dug into her pocketbook and felt for her handkerchief, winding the fabric around her fingers. The tip of her thumb throbbed purple, and she pulled at the lacy edges, making a tear. "Remember what I told you?" Marthe instructed. She was not to look the soothsayer in the eye. She was not to fidget with her clothing, nor handle the objects on the consulting table. And, most importantly, any questions she was asked must be answered truthfully. "She will know if you lie." "Then she shouldn't need my answers at all," protested Nicola. "Come now, my dear," said Mat, "don't be afraid. Madame shall divine a bright future for you. She's most famous for it." Nicola's name was called out. She followed a serving boy into an antechamber, furnished with a round table, 2 cane chairs and a smoky fire. Taking a seat opposite the aged fortune-teller, who was bundled inside layers of dark grey linen and wool, a knitted wrap covering her hair, Nicola recalled her friend's warning. She settled her gaze upon a zodiacal chart hanging on the wall beside the fireplace. A gnarled cross, perhaps composed of driftwood, was mounted above the mantelpiece. She stifled a shudder, wishing for the elegantly framed mirror in her private chamber, which commanded order to the room, a certain comfort. Madame Lagasse demanded Nicola's hand, and she laid it open for inspection. The fortune-teller grunted, pulling Nicola's palm toward her purplish nose. She was half-blind. Disconcerted, for the examination seemed to take a long time, Nicola counted the oranges in a bowl by the window. 6. Under the woman's scrutiny, Nicola's hand felt exceedingly warm. She supposed Madame was making deductions about her home life, judging her by the softness of her skin. Anyone could tell that Nicola barely lifted a finger to do anything aside from study the fashions in Le Mercure Galant and wave a frustrated fist at her husband, or reprimand her son about his German lessons. She felt a blush rise at the thought. "In 2 months," announced Madame Lagasse, "your great trouble will be over, your enemies vanquished." Nicola started, snatching back her hand. The temperature in the chamber seemed to have dropped several degrees. She felt disquieted, noticing, embroidered into the cuffs of the fortune-teller's shirt-sleeves, crescent moons and a death's scythe. The cross above the struggling fire upon closer scrutiny was square, some pagan perversion. She felt a shiver curl down her spine, as if inside the dimpled skins of the oranges were the fetuses of malformed urchins, the shriveled bodies of bats and toads, the familiars of a witch or wizard. Nicola touched the bruise at her ribs. It had healed under the physician's compress, and she was able to bend and sit without pain. In her discomfort, she pressed her fingers into the sore spot again and again, making herself wince while she waited for Madame Lagasse to elaborate upon her mysterious prediction. "I have a husband," began Nicola, unthinking. "I don't see how my troubles could possibly be over while he lives." "Why do you say that?" asked Madame Lagasse. Nicola's tongue had been loosened, as if she had taken too much wine. "He's mean-hearted, jealous. He keeps me to my rooms." It was happening more frequently. Claude visiting her chamber, sullen and sarcastic. Then, when he left, the sound of the key turning in the door. So many evenings spent alone and in silence, not even a servant to speak to. "I see," said Madame Lagasse, drawing her brows together. "Your palm records an unusual twist. Let me cast my tarot." "Please," said Nicola. Madame opened the drawstrings of a red velvet sack. She removed a deck of painted cards and began to shuffle them. Spreading the cards over the table, she instructed Nicola to select 4. A hangman, a fool, a maiden, death. Madame Lagasse's large brown eyes regarded Nicola. The old woman cleared her throat with a brisk cough. "Not more than 2 months from this day's date," she declared, "your life will be changed forever." Nicola's pulse began to quicken. "What do you mean?" "Remember our Lord," intoned the fortune-teller. Efficiently, her face masked, as if she were dealing a second hand to a common gambler, she gathered up the hideous cards. "He protects his flock beyond the last moments of breath." "You mean that I'm cursed?" Nicola said, breathless. She wiped her hands on her skirt, they were grimy and sweaty, and stood, stepping hurriedly towards the door. "If you don't wish to pay, it's your affair," Madame Lagasse called out behind her. "Consider the reading my Christian duty. Forget not your God." She pulled the cord on the sack tight. Nicola realized she had neglected the fee. She dug into her purse and returned to lay several sous on the table. Taken with an ill foreboding, she patted her hot cheeks as she left the tiny chamber. In the waiting room, she grasped Marthe by the elbow. "We're leaving." "What about my reading?" asked Marthe. Puck, clutched to her chest, let out an excited, protesting bark. "Now," insisted Nicola. The fortune-teller had shattered her peace of mind into 1,000 sharp and tiny shards. How far she had fallen, allowing herself to be subjected to such an undignified torture. Part 1. Angelina, the 30th of March. Angelina stood alone by the door, rehearsing the names her mother had mentioned earlier that morning, studiously trying to connect them to the women, and they were mostly women, who were now filling the room. Madame de Surat had arrived early and was sitting close to the makeshift stage due to her fading eyesight. The aging poet was occupied by filling her gloved palm with sunflower seeds, which her pet Alexandrine parrot nibbled. A maid tapped her shoulder and offered a soft cushion for her bottom. Also familiar to Angelina were her sister Deirdre's friends, spread across 2 tables, commanding the full attention of the wine-bearing waiters. Though Deirdre herself was confined to her bedchamber in advanced pregnancy, her friends were already unruly, chortling and talking over one another, as if consignment to the nursery had robbed them of the ability to make meaningful conversation. They appeared to be making up for lost time. Angelina had spent all morning preparing for this event, helping the servants to clean the apartment on Rue Saint-Benoît and directing the kitchen staff about the afternoon's menu. It was the last Tuesday of the month, and as usual, Baroness Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy had opened her private chambers to hold her exclusive literary salon. Across the room, the spry Madame du Noyer, who was hosting the salon, wagged her finger to attract Angelina's attention. "Where is Marie-Catherine?" she whispered when Angelina reached her side. "You know how Maman likes to time her arrivals," Angelina replied, making a wry face. "Shall I ask Sophie to find her?" "It can wait," replied Madame de Noyer. She smiled at Angelina, revealing large, straight teeth, her eyes lit with calculating intelligence, as she moved further into Marie-Catherine's crowded chamber, checking the arrival of the most important guests. A beautiful young woman sailed into Angelina's view, along with a pair of twittering friends. Her extravagant gown was the same pale green as the duck's eggs Angelina used to collect from the convent garden. Her name, Angelina knew, was Mademoiselle Perronel. She was 16, her skin soft as mouse fur, beauty patches on her cheek, and curling lashes framing her brown, almond-shaped eyes. Angelina observed the starched white lace and combs in her wig. How did she keep her head from drooping? She was like one of the sugared pastries on the serving table, enticing Angelina to stare, daring her to take a bite. A giggle cut through Angelina's thoughts. "That jacket! She must have offended her maid," someone said in an affected whisper. She realized that the words came not from Mademoiselle Perronel, but from one of her galleon of lesser vessels, Mademoiselle Jocelyne and Anya, if Angelina remembered correctly, who flanked each side. The group was moving towards her, watching her, their painted lips bunched in derision, heads bent together behind a carved fan to exchange their delicate morsels of gossip. She must have appeared too obviously impressed by the pretty young women. "Which of you is regaling us this afternoon?" asked Angelina, pretending she'd not heard their comment about her handsome but out-of-date jacket, borrowed from her other sister, Teresa. In her bedchamber looking-glass she'd been satisfied, but perhaps the mesdames were correct. Since her arrival in Paris, she had discovered that she had little intuition about face powder and hair pieces and jewelled mules. Baubles on shoes? The abbess would have a fainting fit. "I have a poem," ventured Mademoiselle Jocelyn. "If my name is drawn, I'll be prepared." "I shall listen out for it," replied Angelina. Mademoiselle Peronelle, elbows tucked into her friend's voluminous sleeves, made a hidden signal, and, like a troupe of street performers, they about-faced as one, moving with tiny mouse steps towards the wine table and its orderly arrangement of crystal goblets. Angelina would not let those idiots upset her. With luck, she thought, their pretty shoes would make their toes bleed. She could almost hear the abbess reprimanding her. You should not indulge unkind thoughts. Perhaps the abbess was right. What did they matter? Take away their wardrobes and maids and allowances, and what lay beneath? Puppies climbing over one another for milk. She moved back towards the wall, her eyes once more searching the crowd. It would be refreshing to meet a young woman with interests other than competitive toilette, or with ambitions more original than snaring a beau or feigning excitement over an arranged marriage. When her mother had suggested that Angelina become her secretary, leaving behind the convent in which she had lived since the age of 4, she'd been assured that she would find friends easily. "There are many clever young people in Paris," Marie-Catherine had said. "You'll accustom yourself quickly enough." As the daughter of the great Baroness d'Aulnoy, Angelina would gain entry to the city's highest literary circles, an ideal introduction for a woman of her interests. She was not yet 20, her mother had reasoned. Perhaps the convent was not the best place for her, and life as a nursing sister not her true calling. How would she know if she did not explore the world a little? But, to Angelina's disappointment, it appeared there was little she shared with her mother's young admirers. Angelina watched the mademoiselle, weaving their fingers over the pewter and china plates, selecting fork and serviette, delicately filling their plates with hors d'oeuvre from the city's best chefs. How unfortunate if one of their names should be drawn out of the feathered hat, forcing them to take part in the afternoon's recitals. Their frivolous natures would be exposed. The household's modest staff had begun preparations the day before. The stored chairs and small tables had been brought down from the tiny attic and arranged into groups of place settings. As was tradition, her maman chose to hold her salon in the chamber adjacent to her sleeping quarters, which by day served as her writing room and office. Although the area was not overly large, it was sufficiently sized to house several dozen guests. Welcoming touches of fresh flowers and matching cushions, their finest candelabra, created a cosy, intimate atmosphere. Each set of chairs had been turned to face the balcony doors, the drapes parted and secured with tasseled ties, before which a temporary stage had been constructed. Angelina should have been excited to discuss fairy tales and poetry. She read passionately, and was arguably her mother's biggest fan. So much so that at St. Anne's she had convened her own literary salon. Though there had been no wine, no pastries, and most definitely no famous authors, she nevertheless adored these gatherings. She had relished her position as the daughter of one of Paris's best-known conteurs, storytellers, passionately dissecting the characters and settings in the tales her mother published. It fired her imagination ever much more than chapel, and she had reigned supreme over the group. That is, until Henrietta Dubois joined them. Angelina bit her lower lip. She had vowed to stop doing this to herself. She would face the future. She would not give in to the temptation to ruminate. "Angelina, dearest, there's somebody I wish you to meet." Marie-Catherine clutched the ball of her black lacquered cane, the flesh of her index finger swollen around her signet ring, which denoted membership in a Spanish literary academy. It was an honour she was immensely proud of, particularly as female writers were not permitted to join the French institutions. "Of course, Mamma." Angelina motioned to Sophie, her mother's maid, to change positions. Still growing used to Angelina's addition to the household, the maid paused, checking with a glance that her mistress approved. Angelina stood patiently, and, when her mother was ready, tucked her elbow into Marie-Catherine's and took up the hem of her mother's long black cape. "Thank you, child," said Marie-Catherine, leaning heavily on Angelina, drawing her towards a table near the back of the chamber. Beneath the cape, Marie-Catherine wore her customary sapphire silk gown, silver threads sewn into the bodice and cuffs. Angelina could smell the lavender and rose pomade brushed into her mother's hair, though Marie-Catherine refused to make up her face. Only Sophie and Angelina knew that beneath the rich folds of the dress she wore plain woolen house stockings and comfortable shoes. No stays. Marie-Catherine could not bear her feet growing chill, nor the feeling of the bone-stiff ribs of female underclothing pressing into her waist. "Here he is," cooed Marie-Catherine, addressing 3 young men who sat huddled together, absorbed by the pages of a small notebook. The gentleman holding the book sprang out of his chair, bowing low and kissing Marie-Catherine's bejewelled fingers. "Monsieur Alphonse Apparide." Marie-Catherine glanced meaningfully at Angelina. "Meet my daughter, Angelina, a former sister of St. Anne's." Angelina smiled. Her mouth had gone dry, and she ignored the impulse to swallow. So this was Paris's up-and-coming storyteller, whose praises her mother could not stop singing. "The Baroness has told me much about you," offered Alphonse. Thank goodness he had the sense not to extend to her the over-familiar greeting he had given her mother. She felt herself shrink inside her skin at the thought that he might attempt to peck her cheek. "Don't believe a word," she said, mustering her confidence. "She's known for making up stories." Why must she state the obvious? Marie-Catherine frowned, her close-set, black-brown eyes inspecting Angelina's dress. "Didn't Teresa show you how to tie the waist?" Angelina caught Alphonse's wink. He touched her sleeve and leaned in. "I've been discussing the piece I'm reading with my friends. Perhaps you could cast your eye over it. I'm to perform on stage." "Yes, please," she said, playfully narrowing her eyes at Marie-Catherine. "Before the last vestiges of my confidence are cut away." "Take good care of her," Marie-Catherine said to Alphonse. "She needs a friend, and the best of luck." She turned to Angelina. "Don't eat all the oysters," she cautioned. "You handle her well," whispered Alphonse with an approving nod. "My mother is at pains to please, even with me. Few people are uneasy around her. Have you not noticed?" She observed Marie-Catherine's slow-gaited departure, shaking her head in admiration of her mother's peculiar charms. There was a pause, as she waited, unsure how to proceed. With a flourish, Alphonse drew back a chair, which she accepted with relief. His companions, introduced as a poet and a playwright in training, reminded her of the gauche, book-worshipping novices who had attended her convent salon. Immediately she was drawn into speculations about the afternoon's diversions. "Will we play the pen-portrait game, do you think?" wondered the poet, his blue eyes lit with anticipation. "I'm not familiar with its rules," said Angelina, hopeful that her friendly tone might invite him to explain it to her. "It was invented by La Grande Mademoiselle," interrupted Alphonse, "our king's glamorous cousin. Players are asked to make an inventory of the moral, physical, and mindful qualities of their neighbour." "Oh dear, that could be disastrous," said Angelina. "Perhaps we will create a little drama," said the playwright. "It'll likely be Ovid. We should decide amongst ourselves who is to take the part of Medea or Procne. Might it be you?" He smiled at her. "Do I appear the vengeful sort?" asked Angelina, drawing her brows down in an expression of mock fierceness. The poet smiled. "Alphonse can be our Jason or King Midas." "I rather hope it's poetry," replied Alphonse, sipping his wine. "If we're asked to pen a sonnet or a madrigal, I have every confidence." "You've probably rehearsed one already," teased the poet. "There's a skill to producing a rhyme in the moment, I'll have you know." Angelina listened, a combination of apprehension and excitement causing her stomach to flutter. She concentrated on the waiter filling her glass with wine. As she brought the glass to her mouth to sip, she spilled a little on her chin. She glanced around the table, hoping no one had noticed, and met Alphonse's gaze. Before she could invent an excuse for her clumsiness, Madame de Noailles had taken the stage, rustling her papers and clearing her throat to command the room's attention. Announcements were made. The list of the afternoon's events explained. The opening divertissement would be the pen-portrait game mentioned by the poet, a current favourite. Each guest was to write a little character sketch of the person seated to their left. Angelina picked up one of the quills and a piece of paper from the centre of the table. Monsieur Apéride's smile revealed pointed white teeth, like a cat's, she wrote. That was weak. But what a pleasant surprise, she went on, hidden inside his small mouth. It led one to notice his eyes, green like the lichen on fortification walls. Start again. Like a frog hiding in shadows, a sprig of sage in her basket. Yes, sage. His build was slight, the flaw hardly noticeable. The eye was drawn rather to his purple jacket, his extravagant collar and cuffs. His nose was straight and well-proportioned. Noses were difficult. They usually had a flaw. Snub, bumped, hooked. This spontaneous writing was a challenge. She scratched out the paragraph and folded her paper over. Her table companions wrote furiously, oblivious to the ticking clock, and so did everyone else in the room. Glamour drew her eye wherever it fell. The poet's powdered silver wig, the playwright's enamel and gilt writing case. To Angelina's relief, she was not summoned by the hostess to reveal her muddled portrait of Alphonse. Several charming sketches were shared with the guests, including one by Mademoiselle Agnes. It seemed she should not judge by appearances. Votes were made as to the best portrait by the shaking of one's handkerchief. After much debate, a bottle of wine was delivered to one of the tables occupied by Deirdre's tipsy friends. The next entertainment was Alphonse's recital of a fairy tale. He had been invited to participate in the tradition of sharing an unpublished work with the assembled company. When the recital concluded, the guests, overeager to participate, would offer up their spoken opinions as to how the piece might be improved. The teller of the tale took note of the suggestions and returned home to work on their masterpiece. If the story had potential, they might perhaps be invited at the next salon to circulate the improved version for further comment, or for the mere pleasure of it. After an encouraging jostle from the poet, Alphonse rose unsteadily to his feet and walked to the stage. He faced the audience and began to speak, his voice a little shaky, then seemed to gather confidence. He paced backwards and forwards, reciting a fairy tale about a courtly knight transformed into a dragon slayer and rescuer of wayward maidens. Hardly an original idea, Angelina observed, and yet each sentence was illuminated with a distinct flourish. At one point he shook his fist at the chandelier for emphasis. Technically, her mother's protégé was exceedingly skilled, she thought, but perhaps next time he might keep to the chair that had been provided. His gesturing was distracting, verging on comical. "Pardon me, Angelina." She hadn't heard Sophie approach. "I'm sorry, but you're needed in the hall." "Of course. I'll come right away," Angelina whispered, eyes still on Alphonse. "I'm sorry, it seems urgent," Sophie insisted, with a meaningful look. "It's Madame Tiquet." A servant paced the corridor, his face a desperate frown. Nicola Tiquet stood beside a mirror, gently bumping her forehead into the wall. Her companion, Marthe de Senonville, hovered ineffectually, a hand on Nicola's shoulder. At short intervals, Marthe mumbled into her ear, but whatever she said only provoked Nicola into further protest. Now she was moving her head from side to side. "Let's find you a chair," Angelina said calmly. She took Nicola's hand and pulled, ever so softly, urging her to turn her head. To her surprise, Nicola allowed herself to be walked over to a chaise. "Dear Angela," said Nicola. Her bright blue eyes rimmed red. She reached up and stroked Angelina's hair. "Such a fine colour." Angelina had never seen her mother's sophisticated friend distraught. Even so, she could not help but admire the immense care Nicola had taken with her appearance. A scarlet mantua over a gown of dark green velvet, the gold brocade of the cuffs set off by a pair of sparkling emerald earrings. Nicola had sprinkled silver powder onto her curled blonde wig, and blended rouge onto her sculpted cheekbones and wide pink mouth. The gentlewoman's creamy décolletage, her arched brows enclosing large expressive eyes, were the dream of every portrait painter, and her high state of emotion only added intrigue to her already formidable beauty. Even now, despite her distress, Nicola held herself with practised elegance. It seemed to Angelina that this set her apart from the festival of carping wits that formed Marie-Catherine's writing circle, of which Nicola was most certainly not a member. She was tolerated at the salon for two very different reasons. She donated funds for the supper, and she provided a unique form of entertainment. How the conteurs tumbled over one another to dissect Nicola's outfits, sniping about her enslavement to appearances, each trying to outdo the next in inventing the most searing condemnation of her vanity. But though Angelina didn't know her well, on the several occasions Nicola had visited, she'd taken the time to extend small kindnesses to her. "Let's sit while you gather yourself," Angelina said. "No one wants to see you like this. There's no need to make an appearance at the salon if you're not in the mood. Maman will understand. The salon, said Nicola, squeezing Angelina's fingers. I forgot all about it. It's of no concern, Angelina said gently, careful not to inspire another outburst. But I must speak with your mother, said Nicola. I shall not leave until I have her ear. I'll see to it, said Angelina. It's nearly supper time. You can talk then. Nicola seemed placated for the time being. Angelina sent Sophie and the servant to fetch smelling salts, Marthe to the kitchen to find the medicinal brandy. Perhaps Nicola hadn't taken lunch and felt faint, or had let her bodice be laced too tightly. I can sit with you a while, suggested Angelina. Don't let me keep you from your friends, replied Nicola, glancing at Angelina with concern. I shall be ready in a moment to face the room. I too would be glad to rest. Angelina squeezed Nicola's hand and sighed. I hardly know anybody, and I'm not used to extravagance. She gestured towards her skirt and shoes. But surely you fit Marie-Catherine's crowd, countered Nicola. She touched Angelina's chin, turning her face towards hers. You have a natural poise. It's to be encouraged. I do not see it, replied Angelina quietly, but thank you all the same. She raised her eyes, meeting Nicola's attentive gaze. Perhaps her mother's friend had forgotten her troubles already. Marie-Catherine, the 30th of March. Marie-Catherine pressed her lips together, closing her eyes. The trout pâté melted into a fatty tingle of fish, brine and cream. What did a stutter of indigestion later matter? With only crumbs left on her plate, she glanced at Nicola for permission, received a disinterested nod, and helped herself to her friend's bread. What would I do without you? I missed you in the kitchen this morning, bossing the staff. Madame Darel's meringue is oversweet. Nobody needs me. Marie-Catherine swallowed, narrowing her eyes. What's brought this mood upon you? Where's my assistant disappeared to? Nicola toyed with her fork, resting it beside her plate. She removed a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed her lips. She leaned closer to Marie-Catherine, blinking dramatically. I spent this morning conversing with Lucifer himself. Marie-Catherine flicked at a crumb on her bodice. We should all be so lucky. Marthe tried to cheer my spirits. She took me to her soothsayer, the best in Paris. It was supposed to be a treat. And what did this fortune-teller predict that has you out of sorts? Said Marie-Catherine indulgently. Poor Nicola was far too easy to tease. Nicola regarded her friend, Marthe de Senonville, seated several tables away, fending off the advances of two notoriously loose-lipped matrons. As if intuiting her scrutiny, the trio glanced over, averting their eyes quickly and tightening their huddles. She foretold that in a few months I shall have the better of my enemies, that I'll be beyond the reach of their malice. She grasped the tablecloth in her fingertips. A pair of pale house spiders either side of her plate. What a cruel lie to dangle before me. It sounds like the standard fare of such charlatans, and good news at that. What's unsettled you? Nicola collapsed her finger-webs. Monsieur Tiquet's health is too strong for me to reckon upon a happy ending. I thought you brokered a truce. Nicola shrugged. She dipped a finger in a puddle of caviar and brought it to her lips. You must count your blessings, my dear. Think of your pretty son who brings such delight. You of all wives have managed to thwart the state, even when the odds are so stacked against us. Between you and me, Madame de Noailles also has a husband who runs up debts, and she hasn't the funds to challenge him, as you did. Your wealth is in your own hands. Do you know how rare that is? You are free, my dear. What license you're granted to distract yourself from your husband's petty furies. Yes, he's flighty and unpredictable, but he lacks the means to your purse. Nicola held Marie-Catherine's gaze. My inheritance doesn't prevent his encroachments on my freedom. He's turned my staff against me. He's taken to locking me in my rooms at night. I wish I were more like you, with an iron shutter guarding my heart. Had I your courage—" Marie-Catherine glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. A monkey orchestra set out beneath the brass hands. The supper break was almost finished, and she needed a moment to gather her thoughts before the salon recommenced. She lost count of the conversations they had shared about brutish husbands. She repeated the advice she always delivered at their end. You are more capable of creating meaning, of finding pleasure, than you allow yourself to believe. Look around you, Nicola, she insisted. Each of us here has the capacity for invention, and you're no slouch. You surround yourself with beauty. You have a gift for it. Perhaps you need to go a little further in your efforts to make peace in your home. Why not imagine he no longer exists? Surely that would relieve your suffering. His barbs will fall short of their target. Yes, replied Nicola, sitting back in the chair, tapping the base of her wine-glass. Yes, you're right. It's easy to forget. Pay no heed to that predictor of fortunes. You must forge your own. Take it as a warning that you must always act to improve your circumstances. Perhaps that's all that has been foretold. Marie-Catherine paused. Though I'm not pleased to hear Monsieur's locking you up. Remember, you have me if you ever need counsel. You cannot live in such a manner forever. It's not utterly gloomy, whispered Nicola, bringing the wine-glass to her mouth. Claude's valet, whom I trust absolutely, doesn't always obey his master. A small mercy. Good. Forgive me, but I insist you resume your seat with Martha. She's looking forlorn. Let's start immediately our pledge and enjoy the remainder of the afternoon. Attendees of Marie-Catherine's salon were various, from the humorous Madame de Calmet, wife of a magistrate and enthusiastic versifier of animals, to the formidable Abbesse de Mongault, head of one of Paris's most respected convents, whose tales were of a most earthy nature. For each guest, along with the promise of jousting wits, lay the hope that the future son or daughter of Parisian letters might be discovered. The statesman, poet, playwright, philosopher, actor, riddle-maker even. For it was at these salons that the glimmers of such talents were first displayed, and, most importantly, recognized. Marie-Catherine's gaze swept over her favourite books, shelved in handsome cabinets behind her writing desk. Her dear Greek playwrights and philosophers, the audacious Roman poet Ovid, the Italian tales of bawdy peasant life, intermingled with folklore and magic, written by Boccaccio, Basile, and Straparola. King Henry IV's elegant grandmother, Madame de Navarre, whose Heptameron had struck Marie-Catherine open like a dagger, piercing the heart of her desire to take up her pen. While she knew intimately the stories of the important men of her own century, Racine and Molière, La Fontaine and Pascal, it was to the peers of her own sex that she had accrued her real debt. the novelist's Madame de Lafayette, how she adored the Princess of Cleves, and the Comtesse de Murat, her trip to the country, detailing life in the provinces from the perspective of a Parisian aristocrat undertaking a little jaunt. But it had all started with Mademoiselle de Scudéry, whose 13 volumes of Cellier were spread across an entire shelf of Marie-Catherine's bookcase. Her favourite story was Land of the Sauromates, from the novel The Story of Sappho. Madame de Scudéry was a great rebel, aligning her philosophy with the Greek poet from the Isle of Lesbos, inventing a utopian society composed entirely of women. Though some criticised de Scudéry for being old-fashioned and unapologetically female, Marie-Catherine held only admiration for the stately writer. De Scudéry's notion of les précieuses, or learned women, were the inspiration for her salon. She had wanted to create a place where women might recite their works, rejecting the cruel satirizing of female writers by famous men of letters, Molière, Boileau, Perrault. She felt it her duty to lay bare the dark and piquant potential of women unafraid of their own minds. A bell tinkled, and slowly the salon dissolved into silence. "We've arranged a special treat," began Madame de Noailles. "I wish to call Baroness d'Aulnoy to take the stage to charm us with a fairy tale. It's been far too long since we were indulged." Ignoring the vigorous tapping of forks on glasses, Marie-Catherine allowed Sophie to raise her to her feet. She arranged her features into an expression of nonchalance, holding her head high as she hobbled to the chair set before the balcony curtains. She stood silently before the receptive gathering, as a wave of fear lashed her brain. She smiled at her devotees, recalling, her trick for courage, the letters her readers had sent after the publication of her collection of fairy tales, expressing their appreciation and delight. But it was no use. Her mind was quite empty. She had begun to avoid her writing desk, hopeful that the blankness she felt there would be swept away when she next faced an audience. Would she never again have the pleasure of a new story unfolding upon the stage? She loosened her shoulders, her cape falling in magnificent folds. She let out a slow breath, felt the beetle's carapace of performance settling around her. Why should she be concerned? She knew precisely how to pace her sentences, to unfold the plot of a story, to mimic the voices of her myriad characters. She had a honeyed tongue. She gazed at the assembly and picked out Alphonse, his expression open and encouraging, urging her to begin. Angelina sat next to him, her head held at a slight angle, her chestnut hair combed high off her forehead, which emphasized the graceful tilt of her chin. Catching Marie-Catherine's eye, she leaned over and whispered into Alphonse's ear. He responded, his words causing her youngest daughter to blush. But she quickly recovered, rewarding him with a full smile and a lingering glance from her large coffee-brown eyes. Yes, thought Marie-Catherine, she had made the right choice in introducing them. Angelina's astute and considerate manner would no doubt complement Alphonse's impulsive, dazzling forwardness. Though many young men attended her salons, she rarely found their writing as interesting as that of her fellow women. But Alphonse was a fascinating exception, and she was sure that Angelina would agree. Her daughter had been served well by the nuns, emerging into womanhood without the coquettishness and jocularity of her spoiled peers. Angelina's careful speech, combined with the expressiveness of her features, was a powerful brew. Marie-Catherine wondered if Alphonse had noticed. Though her daughter was free to determine her future, Marie-Catherine had promised her not to interfere. she could not help indulging the pleasant thought. Which reminded her of her signature fairy tale, The White Cat. That was the solution. She would recite it especially for Angelina and Alphonse. Though it was the length of a novella, there was a shorter version, the original Bones, which she had composed in a salon game many years before. As if she were a conduit, she began to speak, following the familiar grooves of the tale. The White Cat opened with an aging king, fearful that his sons would usurp his kingdom before his death. He invented a quest for them to undertake, sending all three out on an adventure to find three things: the world's smallest dog for a pet, a cloth so fine it could be passed through the eye of a needle, and lastly, a princess with whom the victorious son could rule when the king died. The three brothers departed on their separate journeys. At the beginning of his travels, the youngest son was offered refuge by White Cat, a highly cultivated feline who resided in a magnificent palace tended by hundreds of servants. The prince's toilette and dining were performed by disembodied gloved hands, and he was entertained night after night by hunts, jousts, operas, and fêtes. Of course, the prince forgot about his quest until, on the very last day, before he was meant to return to the king, White Cat presented him with an exquisite gift for his father. The young prince arrived and removed the walnut from its box, which was ornamented with rubies. Inside it was a hazelnut, and inside that was a cherry stone. The cherry stone was cracked to show its kernel, which was opened to reveal a grain of wheat, and inside the grain of wheat a millet seed. In his mind, the prince questioned White Cat's intentions, wondering if he had been duped. He found his hand scratched and bleeding from an invisible paw. However, he opened the millet seed, and from inside it withdrew a piece of linen 400 ells long, painted with birds, fish, trees, planets, stars, shells, rocks, portraits of the king and other sovereigns, mistresses, children, and subjects. The needle was brought forward, and the linen passed through its eye 6 times. Writing the tale, Marie-Catherine had discovered her talent for inventing miniature worlds. She felt such pleasure in creating her imagined palaces and kingdoms that she could not stop, and embellished them to perfection, to delight both herself and her readers. But The White Cat was only partly about the quest of the young prince. It was also the story of the feline heroine, who was secretly an enchanted princess. The prince's real test was to prove his love for her, and thereby break the spell she was trapped under. The scene in which White Cat asked the prince to cut off her head and paws to escape her curse still made Marie-Catherine tremble in its daring. The message, hidden in the story for her listeners, was the triumph of true love. Both the hero and heroine created their own futures rather than obeying the customary paths laid down by their families. The White Cat prompted a burst of appreciative clapping. Buoyed by the applause, but physically spent, Marie-Catherine beckoned for Sophie to support her back to her seat, where she would indulge in a welcome glass of wine. Madame Pipette was rapidly approaching her table, urging forward her coltish 15-year-old daughter. She couldn't recall her name, though the pair were regular attendees. "Dear Baroness," Madame smiled, her dark eyes like little raisins pressed into gingerbread. "May I present my daughter, Mademoiselle Sidonie? She's very taken by your story." Marie-Catherine offered her cheek to the gangly young woman, who stood a full head taller than her mother. "She aspires to be a conteuse," whispered Madame, thrusting her chest forward, the flesh spilling from a softly crinkled bodice. "Perhaps you have a word of advice? All she does is scribble in a notebook. It's most alarming." The girl stared at Marie-Catherine, her expression filled with admiration. "What if I wished to share a tale? I have one I like very much, though I fear it might be silly, more for the nursery." Marie-Catherine smiled indulgently. "Don't be ashamed of your writing. It's a gift even to have the desire to turn your thoughts into stories. You must be sure to practice, though, if you wish to progress beyond nursery stories. I suggest you read Mademoiselle de Scudéry's novels. They're filled with instructions about how one might cultivate and display one's wits and ideas." Marie-Catherine paused, searching her memory for the advice she had encountered in her own early days. "You must also be sure your thoughts are worth expressing," she added. "You need experience, my dear, and a fine education. Dabble in languages. Hire a tutor for music lessons. Study portraits and paintings. Reflect upon the ideals of conversation and friendship. Have a romance, though don't lose your head. Visit the opera and the theatre, the market at Les Halles. Then you must mix it all into a great pot. Cook your thoughts in the fire of your imaginings. Hone them before a salon audience where they must be presented prettily sugared and iced." She didn't mention that in truth it would be best if the girl remained unmarried, that she avoided bearing children in order to devote herself to sharpening her mind. That seemed unreasonable. By the time Marie-Catherine had discovered her own talents, she had been firmly saddled with family. Mademoiselle nodded, her eyes wide with enthusiasm. "Perhaps you might send me a story," suggested Marie-Catherine. "I could arrange a recital for you if I liked what I read." "Oh, yes, thank you," said the girl. "And one more question. I don't mean to be forward, but I must know what you're working on now. When's your new book coming? It's been 2 horrid years since your fairy tales were published, and not that I grow bored rereading them." "To the contrary, she'd prefer to be curled up in front of the fire reading," interrupted her mother. "I cannot convince her to take a walk." "I'd rather be with your words," said the girl. Marie-Catherine twisted her signet ring. She looked carefully at the girl. "I'm afraid I cannot share any details with you. I've a horror of frightening away the muses, just a little superstition of mine." Marie-Catherine dared not admit that she had not produced an original sentence in months. When her former assistant, Monsieur Aragon, had suffered a sudden stroke, she had put her lack of inspiration down to the confusion around his death. But she had Angelina now, aptly taking on all his duties, and still she seemed stuck. All the advice and experience and practice in the world was not necessarily any help when one's well had run dry of ideas. Glancing at the spirited conversations taking place at the tables in her chamber, she felt a desolate pain spear her side. What had happened to those hours she used to spend, wresting an idea that would not leave her in peace? The fear rose, an overwhelming surge. If it were her last act, she would again seduce the gods of story to toss their net of wonders at her feet, to strew their gifts before her, and out she would pluck one starfish, one mushroom, one invisible cloak, one prince dressed as a pauper, one naked king. Oh, she would take it all and rush, her apron lifted and bulging with treasure, back to her desk, to make sense of the hoard. Nicola, the 3rd of April. A fragranced pomade burned on the table beside the canopied bed, next to a porcelain vase containing branches of orange blossom, cut from the potted trees in the courtyard, the scent sweetly cloying. A silver tray on the bed covers balanced a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, a platter of bread and cheeses. The letter, inside which a sprig of lavender had been folded, lay tucked under the plate. Seated before the mirror at her dressing table, Nicola touched her fingers to her brows. She was flushed and wild-eyed. She squeezed at the flesh below her cheekbones, biting her lips with her teeth until the blood plumped them red. She dug around in an enamelled jewellery box, lifting out necklaces and holding them to her throat. Too big, too fancy, too ostentatious. She searched for her emerald drop earrings and matching pendant. Perfect. "Beatrix?" "Yes, madame?" Her maid drew a negligée, Italian lace, from the armoire and held it up for inspection. Nicola pressed her lips together and slowly let out her breath. Too obvious. "Is my bath ready?" "Almost, madam. Are you sure?" Nicola stood up, pushing in the upholstered stool. Her hands were trembling, and her heart thrummed. She must collect herself. "It's only a bath, Beatrix. Surely even my husband cannot expect me to go about unwashed." The maid's eyes strayed to the letter on the table. Nicola lifted her chin. "Imagine he no longer exists," she reminded herself, catching and holding the servant's gaze. Beatrix nodded demurely and padded across the large chamber, opening a door that led to the walk-in closet and disappeared. Nicola listened for the click of the door closing. Moments later, her maid reappeared, beckoning with her hand. Somewhere in the gloom behind Beatrix was her loyal servant, Jacques, Claude's valet. He had been guarding the door on the ground floor, on the courtyard side of her townhouse, awaiting the signal. "Quickly!" whispered Beatrix. "Did you remember? The towels and soap?" Nicola's thoughts raced. "They're in the kitchen. Hurry now." She walked between her servants. Jacques ducked under the low brace of the door at the back of the wardrobe, and she followed, Beatrix keeping step behind. They trod carefully, for the staircase was narrow and steep, a corkscrew design. Nicola's hand slid along the stone wall for balance. She was afraid of falling. "Wait." At the bottom of the stairwell, Jacques removed a key from his belt, turned the lock. He opened the door, peering into the twilit courtyard. It was Friday evening. Nicola had given the cook and the scullion an early night. "Now." Jacques held out his fingers, but she kept her hand to herself. She crept across the flagstone courtyard and around the side of the building to the kitchen door. Jacques selected another key and unlocked the door, then waved Nicola and Beatrix inside. The servants had set up the wooden tub in the kitchen, filling it with heated water. Rose petals floated on top. Nicola felt her eyes prickle with tears at their considerateness. A single low lamp burned over the stove. She and Beatrix moved quietly, careful not to wake Nicola's son, Jean-Paul, and his nurse, both sleeping upstairs. "Let me help you." Beatrix eased Nicola's dressing gown off and gripped her by the forearm, then helped her climb into the high-edged tub. Nicola drew in a sharp breath as the water enveloped her thighs, drenching the linen shift she wore, making it drag at her limbs. "Fetch me a glass of wine, Beatrix." She needed to calm her nerves. Beatrix handed her a crystal glass filled to the brim, and she swallowed a large sip. Leave me a moment. Nicola closed her eyes. I'll be near the door. Nicola's chest flushed beneath the thin undergarment. She dipped her fingers into the water, let them slide in the warm fluid. Felt the beads of sweat on her forehead. It was almost too hot. She could not relax. A knock sounded on the back door. "What is it?" she called, irritated. She wanted a few more moments to herself. Jacques burst into the room. He strode past her, eyes averted. "Hurry," he said to Beatrix, and they both rushed out into the hallway. Alone, Nicola placed a washcloth over her chest. She sat up, patting her hair. Voices, Beatrix's and Jacques', outside the kitchen. Was Gilbert early? He must not see her like this. She wasn't ready. She leaned over the bath, spied the bag with its soap and folded towel inside. She reached for the bag, her breasts pushing against the wooden slats of the tub, but she couldn't quite touch the drawstring. She was about to call for her maid to help her out of the bath when the voices in the hallway rose in pitch. A warning. Beatrix appeared again. "I'm sorry, madame. I tried to stop him, but he insists on coming in. He's home early. He saw the flowers in the hallway." "Go and wait near the stairs. I'll call for you." Nicola sat up, drawing her knees towards her chest. She should get out of the water, but she couldn't move. It was as if an arrow were trained upon her. The hearth fire blazed hot at her back, her hair damp against the skin of her neck. "What's all this?" demanded Claude, striding into the kitchen. Behind the bath was the kitchen table, where the cook mixed sauces, chopped and sliced vegetables and meat, and fixed cordials and cups of hot milk. Nicola's husband leaned against the table's edge, his legs crossed. Dressed in his dinner shirt, he was fresh from dining with his cousin, Monsieur Villemain. He folded his arms across his chest. Tingles prickled up and down Nicola's forearms. She adjusted her sopping nightgown, clutching her elbows around her knees. She had carefully considered Marie-Catherine's advice that she make her own opportunities for pleasure, that there was no better way to thwart her husband. To placate him, she had already tried breaking off with Gilbert, and what good had it done? Claude had continued to lock her in her chambers. If she could not leave her home, she'd reasoned, then the pleasure must come to her. Still, she had been surprised when Gilbert Montgeorges agreed to her invitation. He had always been so circumspect and careful. Their romance an affair of tender letters rather than stolen embraces. She met Claude's eyes. "You're early." How could she have been so foolish? How could she have taken such an enormous risk? She controlled her voice. "You forgot to lock the back door to my room. Jacques noticed. Can I not have a bath at my own leisure?" Claude stared at her, black brows drawn over his deep-set brown eyes, his nostrils widened. He plucked at a lock of his hair. Pushing himself off the table, he began to pace the kitchen. "I doubt the door was left unlocked. In fact, I recall instructing my valet to check it had been fastened not once but twice. Why are you lying to me?" Nicola swallowed, casting her eyes over the flower petals floating on the water. "Why do you lock me in my rooms at night? It's no way to treat your wife." She shouldn't provoke him, but she couldn't help herself. Speaking to Marie-Catherine had returned the old fight to her. If he pushed, she might be antagonized into battle. Though quarrelling with her husband was always a mistake. "Who sent the flowers?" "They're from Marthe." Nicholas swallowed the dry lump in her throat. "It's the anniversary of Clotilde's passing." Claude pulled at the ties of his cravat, glancing away at the mention of their daughter. He seemed to consider her explanation. Undoing the complicated knot, he unwound the tie from his neck and tossed it onto the kitchen table, where it landed across a plate of soup. Annoyed, he drew it out and wiped it on a towel. "You think to make a fool of me?" Nicola's toes pushed against the walls of the tub. He walked over to the fire and lifted the poker from its stand, shoved it at a stray piece of charred wood. Sparks flared, the popping of a hot coal as he broke it in two with the tool. Claude hung the poker up. From the corner of his eye, he spied the bag of soap and towels. He picked it up and drew open the strings, scattering the oil, the rose water, and, most damning of all, the pessary for her vagina, onto the kitchen table. "Mon Georges," he muttered, picking up the pessary and throwing it at the wall, where it bounced against a pot and fell to the floor, breaking into clods. A piece of dirt. He crouched by the bath and whispered into her ear, so close she felt his hot breath. "How dare you?" She would not be intimidated. Saliva pooled inside her mouth, and before she could think to stop herself, she spat thickly in her husband's face. She glared at him, defying him to do his worst. She saw the emotions shift across his features. Shock, hurt, and then a slow-mounting rage. Claude stood tall, looming over her cowering form. She had nowhere to go. He reached for her shoulders, wetting the cuffs of his dinner shirt. She could only push with all her might against his hand as it caught her by the hair, thrusting her under the bathwater. The breath was expelled from her lungs, and she was thrashing and kicking against the hard walls of the tub, her dress catching around her legs. She was ready to swallow water, anything to stop the sensation that her burning chest was about to explode from the pressure to inhale. But then, suddenly, no more resistance was needed. She thrust her head and shoulders above the surface of the water, opening her mouth and drinking down the sweet, dry air. More and more she gulped, her fingers wrapped around the edge of the bath. "That's enough!" Jacques was holding Claude in a shoulder lock. He kept his large arms around the smaller man's chest until Claude's heavy breathing subsided. Having caught her breath, Nicola rose to her feet, blowing the water out of her nose. Looking away from her husband and servant, she stepped carefully out of the bath, accepting the towel Beatrix held out for her. She buried her face in the fabric, her fury and terror and shock absorbed by the rough cloth. She could hear the voice of her son's nurse calling down from the top of the stairs. What was all the commotion? Jean-Paul had been woken up.
This ends CD 1. CD 2.
"Almost finished," said Monsieur Cotte. She had never warmed to her physician. If he were a decorator or an author scribbling for Le Mercure Galant, then maybe his squinting gaze stumbling over her wall hangings, her bearskin carpet, her tapestries and armoire might be acceptable. He was constantly calculating and collecting, fattening his tongue so as to entertain his friends, his wife, his housekeeper, she knew not whom, only that the greed of the gossip in him was obvious. Cotte roamed her own person too, glancing a little too long into her eyes, brushing her ear, turning her chin this way and that, dispensing advice while he prodded and poked at the flesh of her forearm for a vein. She lay on the chaise longue in her bedchamber, dressed by Beatrix in a clean nightgown. She was dry-skinned, feeling like a smoked hock, an overripe peach. When she would not divulge her reason for the late-night call, the physician insisted she let him bleed her. Nicola touched the spot where he had nicked her skin with his sharp knife. The wound had already closed, the blood hardening into a small lump. On the table where she kept playing cards and dice sat the bottle of her blood, near black in the candlelight, ready to be bundled into his trunk. She always wondered what he did with it. Did he sell it on to alchemists? Did he keep it for experimentation? Did he toss it onto the fire? "I've finished my sleeping draught," said Nicola. The bleeding had cleared her mind a little. Cot opened his case and removed a bottle filled with brown fluid. "Just a drop, no more." He took out his quill and prepared a receipt. She bade Beatrix to fetch her purse. This was her secret weakness, which she indulged privately, drawing payment from her personal funds. Cot charged extra for his silence, which enabled him to touch his flesh too near to hers, to admonish her, should he be in the mood, like a hated tutor. His departures left a sour coating on her teeth. "Sweet dreams," said the physician, putting on his plumed hat and bowing deeply. In his perfumed gloves sounded the chink of the small pile of coins Nicola paid for the consultation. After Claude had slouched from the kitchen, leaving her dripping by the bath, she had sent Jacques to call the physician and Beatrix to instruct the porter to turn Gilbert away. Only then had she turned her attention to her husband's behaviour. He was seated in the living room, in his brooding chair, head in his hands, brandy by his side, weeping in shame. He begged her to take a drink with him. It would clear the air. She must forgive his rash temper. Could she blame his jealousy? After all these years, she still made his heart quicken. It would never happen again, he promised. She had no idea how he regretted losing control of himself. If he could only take it back. Soaking wet, a towel around her shoulders, she had declined his offer. She needed to check on Jean-Paul, she told him. While Claude might not give a fig, Nicola added, she preferred her son to remain unaware of their quarrelling. After that, if it was all the same with him, she was going to bed. She had a thumping headache. Whether intentionally or not, Claude had neglected to lock her door again. A small mercy. "Is there anything else, madame?" Jacques stood at the entrance to her chamber, the shoulders of his jacket damp from the light drizzle outside. He'd seen the physician to his carriage. "Did Mon Georges come?" she whispered. Jacques scratched his hair. "I'm afraid not, madame." She glanced at the rings on her hands, concealing the disappointment that squeezed at her heart. "I'm sorry, madame," said Jacques. "All's well for now." Her servant lingered, his presence intrusive. She did not wish to be witnessed in such pain. He had seen enough already. She turned, meeting his gaze, intending to dismiss him. But despite herself, she felt her agony rise up, passing from her glance into his. For the shortest moment, it was as if he glimpsed the secret matter of her soul. "Very good," said Jacques. "We'll speak tomorrow." Nicola turned back to her dressing table. She needed to be alone, to put away her pretty things. She needed to take a second dose of the sleeping draught. The numbing effects of the bleeding were already wearing off, and the dull burr of her cares threatened to swarm again. She would lie in bed, waiting for its oily thickness to suffocate the hive of her concerns and deliver sleep. Angelina, the 6th of April. There was a 6-year age difference between Angelina d'Aulnoy and her sister, Teresa Anne Beauvais. Teresa was married to the scion of a wealthy glass-printing family and took great pleasure in her work with the family's firm. It was an unusual marriage for a woman of her rank, a love match, and to a man with no title. But their mother had raised no objection, and the decision had proven quite beneficial. Angelina had been permitted a day's leave from St. Anne's to attend the wedding, and had been warmed to see her sister so happy. There was also a practical side to the marriage. Marie-Catherine had encouraged Teresa from an early age to cultivate her natural talent for painting, hiring Monsieur Thierry Beauvais as a tutor. Unlike Angelina, Teresa and Deirdre were raised by Marie-Catherine, and Angelina did not dare admit to herself the envy she felt about the freedoms her sisters had enjoyed in their girlhoods. Although Teresa had been married 3 years to her former tutor, she was yet to have children. Instead, she painted garlands and pastoral scenes on glassware for the family firm. Her hand was so delicate and fine that clients occasionally requested her by name. As part of her duties, Teresa held mock luncheons and supper parties, inviting customers to admire the tables she laid out with the luxuriously decorated platters, goblets, tureens and glasses the company produced. At least, that was what Teresa used to write in her letters. Teresa had asked Angelina to accompany her on a visit to their father, Baron François de la Motte d'Aulnoy, regarding the overdue payment of a loan from their mother, from whom he was estranged. According to family legend, François had been a handsome youth, so much so that he had captured the eye of César, Duke of Vendôme, the legitimized son of Henry IV, and his mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées. It was no secret that the Duke liked to surround himself with charming young men, and he offered François a position as valet de pied, or first footman. But François was no empty-headed beauty. He possessed a brilliant mind for finances and was rapidly promoted in the royal household, first as valet de chambre and then as contrôleur général, financial advisor to the family. During the years of the Fronde, François made himself indispensable, fighting with Vendôme on the side of the Queen Regent, Anne of Austria, and her cardinal, the controlling and unpopular Mazarin. The Duke had quelled an uprising of noble rebels in Burgundy in 1650, and was rewarded with the position of governor of the province. A year later he was elevated to Grand Admiral of France. In 1653 the Duke was responsible for a major victory, helping to capture an insurgency stronghold in Bordeaux. Angelina had always struggled to imagine her father in such dangerous and fierce conditions. The uprisings of the Fronde allowed François de la Motte to reinvent himself as a titled gentleman. He stayed loyal to the Duke, defeating the aristocratic rebels, and then looting their lands for the crown. The Duke and his men claimed handsome rewards from the booty, such that in 1653 François was awarded the royal title of Chevalier de Saint-Michel. That same week he purchased the barony d'Aulnoy in Brille, sold to him for the sum of 108,000 livres. The village of Aulnoy was not far from a little hamlet called La Motte, where François had grown up. François continued in the Duke's service until his death in 1665. Angelina's mother was fond of reminding her of his profligacy. He played cards, drank, and frequented brothels, seemingly committed to maintaining the habits he had adopted as a soldier. How her mother lamented Francois's decision, not long after the Duke's death, to make himself respectable in the eyes of Parisian society, at least to all appearances. To that end, at 45 years of age, he negotiated with Judith Angélique de Gudin to marry her daughter, Marie-Catherine Le Jumel de Barneville, a 15-year-old girl from Normandy. Angelina acknowledged that her parents had never developed much of an inclination towards one another. As soon as Francois could access Marie-Catherine's modest inheritance, she never ceased to remind Angelina of the fact, he began to spend it in earnest, as if the pot would never empty, as if he had earned it himself. Although they had lived separately for many years, they remained married, and, to the chagrin of her 3 daughters, Marie-Catherine continued to lend her estranged husband sums of money. He seemed to be in constant need of financial assistance, despite his working many years in the service of the Condés, one of the oldest and most illustrious families of Paris. Francois rented an apartment owned by the dynasty, located opposite their palace, the Hôtel de Condé, on Rue Neuve-Saint-Lambert. But the sisters knew better than to search for him there, at this time of day. At 75, Francois was long retired, though he had never given up his love of gambling and frivolity, and the sisters had started their inquiry into his whereabouts at one of the taverns he was known to frequent. An alleyway ran alongside the sprawling post and beam building, and Angelina caught an unpleasant whiff of refuse. She steadied her nerves, linking her arm inside Theresa's. Pushing open the blue door to the tavern, Angelina blinked in the dim, dusty light. Though it was not yet midday, the establishment was loud with card-playing and drinking games. The smell of spilled liquor wafted from the floorboards. Putins, in gaudy silks, sat on the knees of drunken soldiers, taking their leave between battles. Street boys clustered behind thick beams, sharpened knives folded into their grubby palms, awaiting the opportunity to slice the cords of an unattended purse. Firm in their footsteps, the sisters raised their chins and ignored the surly commentary that rumbled around the room. It was no secret they were collecting money from a wayward fellow. There was no other explanation for the appearance of 2 respectably dressed women. Whistles, table thumps, and shrieks ensued. A jagged scar ran over the publican's cheek, disappearing into his hairline. Theresa asked if he knew the whereabouts of Baron d'Aulnoy. "It'll cost you." Angelina caught the fellow's foul breath and stepped back from the counter. She glanced around the room. "Never mind," said Theresa. She gripped Angelina's hand. "There he is." She pointed to a broad-shouldered figure hunched over a pot of beer at a corner table near the fire. "Now, don't be offended or shocked," Theresa whispered, "at what I might say. It's an act. You need not defend me. Just give the old goat a fierce staring down. I wish Deirdre were here. She's so much better at negotiating with him than I am." "Papa," said Theresa, drawing out the low wicker seat opposite the dishevelled man. Baron d'Aulnoy's wig was slipping. His black velvet jacket, brocaded in gold thread, glinted in the candlelight. The man glanced around him, rheumy eyes moving from one sister to the other. He squinted. "Theresa! What a blessing! Can I order you a drink?" His gaze flickered over Angelina's high-cut blouse, sweeping up her neck and settling on her face. "And your friend?" His voice sounded gruff. Angelina felt herself shrivel from the inspection. "I've brought Angie to meet you," said Teresa, pushing Angelina in the ribs with her elbow. "She's grown into a fine mademoiselle." Angelina offered her hand. "You're a little thin," said Francois, bending his lips to her gloved fingers. Angelina smiled. "It's good to see you, Papa. It's been too long." "We cannot talk here," said Teresa, glancing at a prostitute seated on a soldier's lap, inserting his hand into her loosely tied bodice. "Come, there's a coffee house we passed on our way. You can order a nourishing meal."
"Where's my Deirdre?"
asked Francois. "She's unable to travel just now, but she sends her love."
"Ah, the little one on the way again."
Francois raised his brows. Teresa nodded. She motioned to Angelina. "Help me." Angelina moved around to her father's left side. It was not yet mid-morning, but their father appeared to be staggeringly drunk. They hoisted him out of the tavern and hobbled down Rue Saint-Lambert. Despite Francois's dishevelled appearance, Angelina found herself admiring his fuchsia stockings. She was similarly impressed by his shoes, an arched high heel, fat ribbons tied over the buckles, and his brocaded cape. The carved scabbard in which he sheathed his sword. Her mother had spoken of his handsomeness, his penchant for the latest fashions. The last time she'd seen her father was on her 16th birthday. He had visited her at St. Anne's and insisted she accept the black kitten he had brought her as a companion. The memory made her smile. She'd been touched, then bitterly disappointed when the abbess confiscated the tiny creature, and not at all amused when she discovered some months later that the old nun had kept the kitten for her own. They accepted a table before a window in a bustling coffee-house, potted roses decorating each place-setting. Angelina picked up her father's tricorn hat, black felt, grey ostrich plumes affixed to the brim. Her mother would flinch at the expense of such an item. Ordering their meal, Francois seemed to revive. The redness that flushed his cheeks as they walked to the coffee-house had drained away. Angelina wondered if her father might not be drunk. He certainly did not smell drunk, but rather unwell. Was a valve inside his chest clogged with gum? As they waited to eat, Francois demanded that she stand before him. He wanted to have a good look at her. She stood up from her chair, twirling before the fire in her light amber skirt and bodice, self-conscious about the plain ribbon she had used to tie back her hair. The pale flesh of her ears and neck unadorned with jewellery, aside from the silver crucifix at her throat.
"I smell the whiff of nuns," observed Francois.
"Come now, Papa." Teresa glanced at Angelina, apologetic. "I'm sure in time it shall disperse," Angelina said, smiling. "I'm working with Maman, helping her with her writing. A more fitting occupation, surely."
"You may do as you please."
A smirk lifted the corners of Francois's mouth.
"But perhaps, if you wish to make a splash in Parisian society, you might take some lessons from Teresa, eh?"
"I learn quickly," replied Angelina. Why did she feel like a mute child before him? He was teasing, and yet she felt the sting in his words. But then she wholeheartedly agreed with him. Her clothes were a problem. Thus far, her desire to improve her style had only manifested in nightly prayer. Perhaps it was time to take more worldly action. Luncheon was brought to the table on a wooden tray. Clay bowls of steaming hot soup, a loaf of bread, and 3 tiny cups of coffee.
How is the dragon? Francois raised an eyebrow at Teresa. I presume she's behind this lovely little surprise?
I'm afraid she is. I promise we won't keep you. Teresa drew a letter of credit from her purse. I'm told you're familiar with the terms. Mother's banker has sent 3 notices, which she claims you've ignored. She wishes to know when the funds will be paid into her account. This is your final warning, she said to tell you, or she shall send others, not as pretty-faced as we two, to settle things.
Is that so? Francois laughed. Well, this is a surprise. I'd like to see her try.
She's come upon difficulties, said Angelina. Don't be unfair.
Yes, daughter. The Baron turned to Angelina. Much as I'd like to help Marie-Catherine, I have my own financial affairs to tend.
Such as?
Asked Teresa. Grimacing, Francois touched his ribs. Well, the surgeon, for a start. I have bone pain, back pain, carbuncles, mucus of the throat, dropsy, 3 teeth to be drawn. Need I continue?
I'm sure you'll feel better when you've slept off the wine you drank last night, said Teresa. What shall I tell Mother?
Tell her I'll settle it with Deirdre, said Francois. When are you gracing me with a grandchild?
Teresa's poised act faltered. I'll not be diverted by your dancing around the topic, Papa. It's none of your business. Besides, I'm wholly absorbed painting pretty vases. I barely have the time for my own upkeep, let alone a child's. Our order book is full for months.
Forgive me, said Francois. There's no call for cheap comment. Don't you feel a little queer, toiling for your husband's family? If you were under my control...
Teresa caught Angelina's eyes. I warned you. Not at all, replied Teresa. I enjoy it immensely, as I'm sure I would enjoy children should God grant his blessing on me. Angelina sipped from an earthenware cup, her tongue curling at the bitter-tasting coffee. Surely you're familiar with Teresa's painting talents. It's dull not having an interest, some passion to direct your thoughts.
But no more the church? Francois addressed Angelina. Isn't it altogether odd to find yourself freed of the cloister, roaming about Paris?
Perhaps, replied Angelina. I cannot yet tell. She was lying. Her father had put his finger on her problem and was pressing down on the infected spot beneath her skin.
That damned woman, said Francois.
He took Angelina's hand in his.
Remember, you're not under the gaze of God's narrow-eyed army any more. There are many pleasures to be enjoyed in this city.
Father, said Teresa, can we return to Mother's bill? Angie's perfectly capable of adjusting to life beyond St. Anne's. She needs no rushing, nor corrupting, I might add. Teresa's eyes glinted. Now she was teasing him. Angelina finished the last spoon of her onion soup. She pushed her chair back, pleasantly full, refreshed by the coffee. Her father's flippancy was a welcome diversion from her mother's fretting. She was quite enjoying escaping Marie-Catherine's underheated, poorly aired chamber and her continual complaints about unpaid accounts. Leaving the coffee-house, Francois put his pretty shoe in a mound of dog excrement, letting loose an invective about ruining the brocaded toe. Angelina made herself busy, securing 2 palanquin bearers to carry him back to his apartment. She told him to rest, to try and sleep. Travelling in a rented carriage, Teresa expressed frustration at her father's slippery behaviour. They had come away from lunch minus the cost of the 2-course meal they had shared and not a single sou of their mother's owed coin. Francois had given one concession. He promised to honour his debts when Deirdre's child was born, if he were permitted to visit her. The carriage rolled to an abrupt stop on Rue Saint-Germain. A commotion was taking place up ahead as a package from a carriage was unloaded onto a cart. Angelina peered at 2 merchants, dressed in exquisite magenta and indigo capes, wigs scrolling down their shoulders like exotic bird plumage, in the middle of conducting a heated argument. "I'm sorry about Papa," said Teresa. "You don't have to apologise for him. It was my idea to join you," said Angelina. Teresa offered her a snack of nuts and marzipan. "You look pale." She touched Angelina's chin, forcing her to turn from the carriage window. "Are you feeling well?" "Papa's right. I have few charms," she sighed. "You shall find a friend. Don't you remember our discussion? You must stop moping over Henrietta." Angelina nodded. She would do her best not to feel sorry for herself. "There is a little something, though I'm not sure what to make of it." "You must share." Angelina removed the letter she had tucked into her bodice and handed it to Teresa. Returning to her seat after speaking with Nicolas Tiquet at the salon, Alphonse had teased her for not listening to the conclusion of his tale. His performance must have been truly terrible for her to leave the room. She had blushed, and to cover her embarrassment, offered to make amends. "I asked him to send me a copy so that I might scribble a comment or 2 of encouragement, and he's taken me up." "You must have made a favourable impression." "He's like Maman, hungry for attention. It's nothing more, I assure you." Her maid Lise had delivered the letter on her mother's tray that morning. Inspecting the unfamiliar seal, she'd torn open the envelope. 2 small pages, on the first a sonnet. She counted the lines and metre without thinking. An Alexandrine. A finger to her lips, she studied the crowded letters. The rhymes were fresh. Feminine vowel structures following the masculine. A brilliant couplet for the envoy that made her nod in surprise and recognition. The sonnet was an adaptation of the myth of Psyche and Eros, describing the scene in which Eros's monstrous identity is revealed in the light of the curious girl's lamp. Alphonse had given Eros the form of a silver serpent, a novel twist on Apuleius's tale. Psyche, unfortunately, was a little dim-witted for Angelina's tastes. She preferred Marie-Catherine's resourceful heroines. Perhaps Psyche might challenge the serpent, put him on his guard, rather than gleefully submit to his coiled embrace. The second page was a short letter. "Tell me your thoughts. I would love to hear your response." Alphonse had composed the verse after the salon, quickly dashing it off. She must tell him if it failed, for now it was but an exercise. He planned to add more stanzas, to work his way deeper into the story, although it was this scene that gripped his imagination. Angelina smiled, wondering if Alphonse was familiar with The Great Green Worm, her mother's interpretation of the same Roman love story in which the monster also assumed the form of a charming, rich and slithering green serpent. Marie-Catherine's tale contained elements of the fairy story Parcelinette by Charlotte Rose de la Force, including a princess locked away in a tower by a wicked fairy. But in The Great Green Worm, seclusion was chosen by the heroine Laidronette. The fairy, not invited to the princess's christening feast, had cursed her with ugliness. the girl preferred to hide away, rather than offend those who loved her most with her hideous appearance. At its heart, the tale was, of course, a love story, like its predecessor. Greenworm and Laidronette, by the device of long, intimate conversations, learned to love each other and their once despised selves. They worked together to undo the spells that kept them locked inside false appearances, returning to their original human forms. Perhaps the princess's banishment was the feature that made the great green worm one of Angelina's favourites. But she was also thoroughly enchanted by the wonderful fairy battle it contained. The tiny pagoda people of Green Worm, waging war with the wasp and butterfly army controlled by the wicked fairy. Alphonse had signed and then added a postscript, hoping she had not found his recital altogether unsavoury. He would like a letter in return, if she fancied. If she was not taken with the poem, might she share her experiences of Paris since leaving St. Anne's? He was interested to hear her thoughts. "Will you reply?" asked Teresa. "I'm yet to decide." "Oh, you must. It's time to enjoy life a little. Put that silly convent behind you." Angelina took the letter back and tucked it away. The carriage had resumed its journey, and she had an urgent task. She needed to collect her impressions of Paris's colourful streets. Marie-Catherine, the 6th of April. The English translation of The Lady's Travels into Spain, 2 small calf-bound volumes, had been delivered with Marie-Catherine's morning correspondence. Discovering the package on her desk, she'd taken it, along with her coffee, to the chaise longue before the fire. She would take a few precious minutes to linger over its touch and smell. How delightful to have her novel translated into another tongue. Opening the first volume, she traced the frontispiece, an engraving of a woman dressed in a Roman soldier's helmet and scrolling robes seated before an imposing desk. The woman's palm gestured towards an elegant library, while a globe of the world and a mounted lion's head sat at her feet. The Lady's Travels into Spain was Marie-Catherine's most popular book, a fictional history in letters, much of it drawn from correspondence with her mother, Judith Angélique de Gudin, who had relocated to Madrid shortly before Teresa's birth. The book had been revised and corrected for reissue by her Parisian publisher, Claude Barbin, the previous year. 5 years after publication, it still sold in respectable numbers, a fact that had given Marie-Catherine some power in suggesting a revised edition. She recalled her victory at convincing Barbin to reset the print, removing typesetting errors and revising several epistles she was unhappy with. She rewrote the foreword to include advertisements for the book she had published in the years between, Memoirs of the Court of Spain and Memoirs of the Court of England, and added another name to the author dedication. Less than a year after its initial release in France, The Lady's Travels into Spain was translated into English. Like its French counterpart, it proved a popular title with readers across the Channel, each reprinting selling steadily. Based on her success with Barbin, she negotiated a revision of the English text with her Amsterdam-based international publisher, Cornelius Alberts. She was impressed with the tooling on the leather cover, a flourish the plain French version lacked. Heaving herself to stand, she walked to her library. The top row of the cabinet was reserved for her publications, and she neatened the dozen titles, pressing them to one side to clear a space. She felt grateful for her drive and imagination, for those who had encouraged her during the long apprenticeship of becoming a writer, for time, a place to craft words, an ability to narrow her attention. But she also felt unsettled. With no new book in progress, how could she call herself an author? She recalled her thoughts during the salon. She'd been intending to write a second book of fairy tales, but whenever she sat down at her desk, she would draw a blank. She'd tried to press her concerns away, secure in the idea that the inspiration would arrive in its own good time. But as the months wore on, she had begun to grow concerned. She wondered sometimes if it was the fairy tales that were the problem. Perhaps she had done all she could with handsome princes in magical lands. Was she trying to support the fairy tale vogue rather than listen to her deeper interests as a writer? She knew it was not possible to force an idea. Before the publication of her book of fairy tales, she had written a historical novel, The Prince of Carency, set in the English court. Disguised in its pages were veiled criticisms of the lack of freedom in women's lives, in France as in England. She recalled how her patron, the Princess de Condé, had loved the book, appreciating the picture she had drawn of the heroine's thwarted agency in the court of Charles II, and asking if she might write another instalment. While her fairy tales were loved, she was never certain that her readers understood their messages of protest. Perhaps she was wasting her time advocating for women's lives in fantastical stories. Perhaps she needed to use a more direct approach. She stepped back from the bookshelf, admiring the elegant new spines in her collection. It was decided. She would take up her patron's invitation and pen a novel about the lives of women in France as they were that very moment, championing for increased freedoms in the weavings of its plot. She would need to cast about for a suitable heroine. Above the fireplace was an etching of herself, dressed in the robes of Clio, Muse of History. The portrait had been commissioned by the Accademia del Ricovati of Padua to honour her contributions to French literature. Its twin was on show in the Association's dining hall in Madrid, amongst a phalanx of similarly esteemed writers. It had always been a source of pride for Marie-Catherine. How grand this edified, gracious woman appeared, the linked chains of the heavy medallion she wore around her neck, the curled piles of her lustrous silver hair, her full smooth breast, the confidence and slight defiance in her hooded eyes, the haughty set of her mouth. Arranged on the mantelpiece, beneath the portrait, was a collection of figurines representing characters from her tales. A glass snake, a team of enamelled frogs drawing a carriage, a carved blue-painted bird, a dwarf in a pretty yellow suit. She touched the Delft figurine of a cat, a gift from Cornelius. Next to it was propped a doll, Princess Félicité, from her story The Isle of Happiness, with moving joints made of wood and a layered skirt and petticoats, tiny stitched leather boots, and real human hair in a deep shade of red. A token of appreciation from Abbess Devereux, the former head of St. Anne's, and her first writing mentor. She recalled Mademoiselle Sidonie's eager face at the salon. Had Marie-Catherine been glib, instructing her about the tools needed to begin a writing career? It was not as simple a task as she had suggested. It had taken time to grow used to the convent that had become her refuge after separating from her husband, after her mother left France. But she had learned to give over the care of her daughters to the kind sisters. She found an ally in Abbess Devereux, a relationship of saviour and dependent that slowly transformed into friendship. In those days she spent many evenings in the abbess's library, reporting her opinions of the titles she borrowed from the convent's extensive collection. The abbess bought all the fashionable novels, and at the time there had been a great vogue for stories featuring adventurous women. The Duchess de Longueville, who had been a driving force in the Fronde, even taking up arms against the king, had been exiled to Saint-Cloud, where she started a literary salon. She wrote of her childhood at the French court, which was transcribed by her secretary into a series of books that Marie-Catherine absorbed into her skin as a template for the life a free-thinking woman might lead. Every volume she opened boasted exploits of women who eloped with their lovers, who controlled their fortunes, who dressed as men to defeat armies, who hosted intellectual gatherings attended by loyal patrons. The stories were such a contrast to her experiences that she would sometimes feel the most acute despair. Abbess Devereux encouraged her, telling her that she expressed her thoughts with wit, passion, and insight. The nun delighted in the workings of Marie-Catherine's mind and reassured her that the hours she spent engrossed in a book were not wasted. Reading could be a form of healing. One evening, the abbess asked her a strange question. Had she considered writing a story of her own? Marie-Catherine had laughed. What a preposterous notion! But the abbess's idea revealed a hidden well, and she was overtaken by the desire to sit at her small desk by the window, writing down the scenes that plagued her thoughts after hours of feverish reading. She became fascinated by the abbess's histories of the English and French courts, the manners and alliances of the squabbling dukes and duchesses. But she remained reluctant to share her own undisciplined scribblings on these subjects. She was teased by the abbess. She must be working on something grand. Behold her private smiles, her guarded responses. And then the notion came to her. She would tell the nun a fantastical tale, a story like the Italian fables her father had read to her as a young girl, with kings and journeys and strange magical creatures. A conte des fées. The term had drifted into her head. Yes, that was it, a fairy tale. She made up the story in the abbess's reading alcove, which smelled of lemon tea and damp. Surprised by what she invented in response to her friend's gentle encouragement, she returned to her room to write it down. The hero of The Isle of Happiness was Prince Adolf, who had been out hunting bears in a Russian forest when he became separated from his party. He found shelter in a cave, which happened to be the home of the winds, Zephyr, Aeol, Boreas, and their elderly mother. Hearing talk of a beautiful princess who lived on a mysterious island, the prince persuaded the youngest wind, Zephyr, to take him there the following day. Princess Félicité, a fairy who had never encountered a human man, quickly made Adolf her firm favourite. She ruled over her magnificent kingdom without wars and fighting. The days passed with ceaseless entertainments provided by a host of musicians and courtesans. One day, recalling the kingdom he had left behind, Adolf asked the princess how long he had been residing at her castle. He was shocked and dismayed to learn that 300 human years had passed, and determined to depart the island immediately, for he had long harboured plans to leave a mark upon the place of his birth. Heartbroken, Princess Félicité granted him freedom, and he set off, hoping to carry out heroic deeds and secure his place in the history of his homeland. Soon he stumbled upon an old man pinned beneath the wheel of an overturned chariot. As Adolf stopped to help, the man sprang to life and seized him around the neck, not releasing his grip until all the life had been squeezed from the prince's body.
for the man was Father Time, and he had been combing the earth for Prince Adolf, who had eluded him for so many years. Marie-Catherine had given her first fairy tale a tragic ending, only learning later how to provide more satisfying conclusions for her readers. Although she was famous for her salon fairy tales, it had taken many years for her to return to the form, and now each attempt at entering that world was failing. Her first publication, The History of Hippolyte, was a novel, a romantic adventure packed with duels, piracy, intercepted letters, disguises, attempted suicides, robberies, and a terrible fire. It featured two aristocrats, Julie and Hippolyte, who fell in love as children and, determined to avoid the marriages arranged by their families, plotted to run away together. The Isle of Happiness was included in the novel, interspersed within a scene inspired by Marie-Catherine's experiences in St. Anne's. It even depicted a fictional abbess who collected art and was most strict in her observance of poetry. Publishing the very first written fairy tale had proved to be an inspired choice for Marie-Catherine, and while her earliest novel had not sold near the number of copies that her Spanish travel tales had, it remained a sentimental favourite. The mantelpiece clock chimed the hour of 10. She had best begin her day's work. Sitting at her walnut writing desk that morning took an especial effort. It was a tussle. She took frequent breaks, pushing herself painfully to her feet to remove a volume of recently published fairy tales by Madame de Murat from the library, rereading the title story. How strange that she was scanning the works of those writers she had helped cultivate, who used a style that she herself had invented. She began a character sketch and made several jottings for settings and a time frame, and looked up a reference to an historical murder. With a prickle of envy, she recalled the story Alphonse had recited at the salon, his impeccable flair for phrasing. Her every effort felt ugly and deliberate. Bored by her lack of engagement, she fretted that her readers would feel the same. No matter the strong tea and coffee she had Sophie bring up from the kitchen. The coffee made her bowels quake, not to mention the pastries she stuffed into her mouth, swallowing without appetite or enjoyment. Her thoughts refused to knot and form into a coherent pattern. Voices sounded from downstairs, and she rose to her feet, eager for distraction. She opened the door to her chamber and called into the hallway. Angelina had returned home, and she invited her upstairs, hoping for good news. "I trust you found success?" "There's to be a delay," replied Angelina. Marie-Catherine squeezed the fingers of her left hand and winced, drawing in a slow breath. Thanking Angelina for carrying out the errand, she asked if she might examine her feet, which burned in pain. She had the gout, according to her physician. Angelina instructed Marie-Catherine to lie on the chaise longue and began to remove her house slippers. "Have you been putting the bolster under your ankles?" "I keep forgetting," said Marie-Catherine. She closed her eyes, protesting every now and again as Angelina turned her legs this way and that, squeezing the small bones of her toes. They gave her the devil's trouble. Her ointment was somewhere on her desk, she said. "Is this it?" asked Angelina, taking the stopper from a brown bottle and sniffing at the contents. She crinkled her nose, grimacing. Marie-Catherine nodded. "It's rancid. It won't be any help." She rang the service bell, and when her maid Lise appeared at the door, asked her to bring up some kitchen oil and a cloth. "This might hurt, but when I'm finished you shall have relief. It's a trick I learned.
Sister Agatha had arthritis that used to flare up in the cold.
But it's spring.
Perhaps it's worrying about Papa, Angelina teased. Lise returned with the oil, and Angelina poured some onto her palms, rubbing her fingers together. "It's a shame we don't keep a herb garden," she remarked, her voice brightening. She began to move her thumbs in swirls over the soles of Marie-Catherine's feet. "I rather miss it. Sister Agatha instructed me in what to collect. You would not believe the secret vexations the senior nuns suffered, all their daily qualms and pains. But I found the afternoons passed quickly in the company of my plants. I learned how to pluck out the weeds. I had my own little watering can and a tiny sickle, which I kept bundled inside my apron to take clippings." She told Marie-Catherine to raise her legs, then sat on the chaise, patting her lap for Marie-Catherine to put her feet there, so she could more easily rub her heels.
"Too hard," muttered Marie-Catherine, frowning.
"Trust me," said Angelina. "I have a talent." She pinched a toe, musing. "There was one afternoon. It was summer, very hot. I recall how desperately I wished I could take off my veil. I'd been working in the garden when Sister Agatha summoned me." Angelina smiled at Marie-Catherine. Nursing duties had always loosened her tongue. She secretly relished the chance to weave a story, and she'd found that it provided her patients with a distraction from their pain. "I'd never seen Sister Agatha like that before." Usually her expression only ever changed discussing the properties of plants. When the abbess was distracted by an important visitor, Sister Agatha and I would sneak into the kitchen and mix up recipes from her herbal manuals. But that day there was no joy on her face. She told me that a novice had been struck down by a wasting fever. Naturally, I put aside my basket and followed her into the kitchen. There was a long wooden bench there that was always covered in turnips and onion peels, the pot of beans stewing over the fire. "Oh, Maman, I do not miss the food."
"I imagine not," said Marie-Catherine, wincing as Angelina pressed a tender spot.
"Well, in the infirmary, we found a gaggle of senior nuns crowded about the doorway," Angelina went on. "Sister Agatha shooed them away. I'd never heard her speak like that. I caught a glimpse of young Lily's face, and suddenly I felt very frightened. The poor girl was only 9. She was an orphan. She lay prostrate on a cot, hands clasped over her chest, her cheeks slick with fever, sweat pooling at her neck. The chamber pot on the floor was filled with yellow bile. But then a sort of calm settled around me. I remembered a cure I'd read about in one of Sister Agatha's books. She let me borrow several volumes at a time, and I used to study them long after our candles were supposed to be extinguished. I recognized a pustule on the girl's arm, a rash on her chest, tiny, itchy welts. Something came over me, and soon it was I rather than Sister Agatha giving instructions. Over the next few days, 3 more girls were admitted to the infirmary with the same affliction. I watched over them the entire week, snatching an hour or so of sleep, bathing them, dabbing at their itching skin, spoon-feeding them broth. It was as if I'd been called to something bigger than myself. I didn't have a care for my own comfort. I recall thinking that if I were struck down, it would be God's will. But I was spared. On the 7th day, the fevers broke, and one by one the girls began to recover. There were no lingering ailments or permanent malaise. It was the strangest thing.
"It's as well I took you away before you caught your own death," muttered Marie-Catherine. "Are you feeling that special sense now? Perhaps you can heal me."
I'm no miracle worker, Angelina said with a laugh. But perhaps I might visit your apothecary. I'll have a chat to the fellow who compounds your ointment. I know of a herb that might soothe your pains.
I'll try anything, said Marie-Catherine, grimacing.
Angelina's colourful story had returned her thoughts to her own failed writing attempts. Perhaps she should confide in her daughter. She could benefit from her insight and advice. She forced a smile onto her lips, catching Angelina's gaze.
I might have an idea. At least, I hope it's one. I'm going to try a different style of book. Not fairy tales, but a courtly romance, set in France. Now, under the reign of Louis. It's something I've never dared. I always worried that it might be too risky to write closely about our times. But what's stopping me? All I can do is make the attempt. It's better than an unmarked page.
It sounds intriguing, replied Angelina, and you'll be in fine company. Madame de Lafayette and Madame de Murat have both done so. Do you have any characters yet?
Nothing definite, I'm afraid. But I do have the courtly setting and the time period. It shall be packed with intrigue. A heroine, who's a thoroughly modern Parisian woman. Suitors jostling for her attention. There'll be a duel, maybe. A series of letters intercepted by the wrong person. Perhaps escape across the channel. A hideaway in the country somewhere. Marie-Catherine drew in a breath. I know it sounds like very little, but it's time for me to make another attempt at a book. Angelina was smiling.
I'm thrilled to hear this, Maman, and I'm as eager as you to begin working. It's been on my mind, if you must know. I'm used to a busy schedule. Not that I regret leaving St. Anne's, but I keep casting about for more work to do. I didn't wish to raise it with you. I'm so grateful you've given me this opportunity, but you must put me to better use. Imagine I'm a magical mirror. I can reflect your ideas back to you, help to clarify them even. We've been a team before. Angelina paused, tapping her fingertips together, thinking. Shall I bring your writing materials in? We could make a start right now.
Oh, dear girl, said Marie-Catherine, smiling and closing her eyes. We will, very soon, I promise, but not just yet, at least not today. I need to rest.
Nicola, the 6th of April. Raised men's voices sounded 3 floors below Nicola's bedchamber, directly outside the entrance to her townhouse, near the lamp that burned on the wrought-iron mount.
What's all the commotion? asked Marthe, laying down her cards. She stood and swept aside the curtain. Come, Nicola, look! Nicola turned from the tray of spirits. During her evenings spent locked in her chambers, she had learned to serve herself. The first tumbler had eased like warm caramel into her throat and stomach, and she needed another. She brought the drinks to the round table, where their game of conquillon was laid out. There had been a tiny sliver of light in the aftermath of her last confrontation with Claude, in that he had permitted Nicola to resume her weekly card game with Marthe. Before departing for his dinner appointment, he had made a show of unlocking Nicola's door and ushering her companion into the room, then quietly locking it once more. A scream sounded, and then the unmistakable crack of a pistol, quickly followed by a second shot.
My dear heart!
Nicola grabbed Marthe's hand. They ran to the door of Nicola's bedchamber.
Wait!
She bent down to feel the lump in the hem of her nightdress and drew out the brass key Jacques had given her, asking Marthe to fetch a candle holder. Arms about each other's waists, they climbed down the staircase at the end of Nicola's closet. The night guard had fallen asleep.
Nicola slapped him around the face. Flinching, he blinked open his eyes. "Unlock the gates!" she commanded, her voice rising in pitch. The man glanced at Marthe and frowned. "But, monsieur," he protested. "Don't you hear all that noise? I order you! Open the locks!" The burly fellow struggled to his feet and fiddled with the keys at his waist. "Hurry!" urged Marthe. "Someone's being murdered!" The guard pulled back the heavy gate for the two women to pass through. Nicola turned to him. "Pack your things and leave immediately." Marthe had not exaggerated. A figure lay half on the footpath, half on the street. The lamp had been smashed, and he appeared to be alone. Nicola regretted her harsh words to the guard. They needed him. She was in luck, for he was slow-witted, still drowsy, and had barely registered her dismissal. She bade him find the second guard, rouse the porters, and light all the lamps they could find. Groans. The man moved as if to clutch his chest, but could not summon the strength. It was him. She had known it in her bones. His neat, tied-back hair, the blue ribbon he always affixed to dine with Monsieur Villemain, his burgundy coat, slashed in 5 places, the buttons taken off, his white jabot pooled with blood. "Fetch Villemain," Nicola instructed a porter, though she barely knew her husband's relative. Where was Jacques when she needed him? He would have the police summoned, with the surgeon called, the brandy ready for her husband's pain. Nicola knelt beside Claude. She moved to touch the wound in his shoulder, for he had been shot twice with a pistol. Stabbed, too, though no weapons lay in sight. Blood leaked onto the cobblestones, the pool growing. She loosened her cape, bundled it into a ball, and pressed it to the gaping wound in his chest. He moaned, lifting his head. When he saw it was Nicola tending his wounds, Claude began to shout. "Leave me be! Get away from me!" "Hush! You'll rouse the neighbours," she whispered softly, trying to calm him, to stop him thrashing about and using up the last of his strength. She told him she had called Villemain and instructed the guard to fetch the police commissioner and their physician, Monsieur Cotte. "Come," she said to Marthe. "We need to bring him inside. Put him on the kitchen table. We'll have cook clear a space, quickly." Claude Tiquet's tricorn hat, its feathers flecked with blood, lay in the middle of the road. Not wishing to further upset her husband, Nicola eased herself to a stand. She picked up the hat and dusted it off. The buckle, slashed from the band, fell with a clatter to the ground. Heavy footsteps sounded. Claude's cousin lived several buildings away, and his staff, cravats loosened and shirts untied, they had been playing cards too, arrived in a confused troop. "Come now," said Marthe, wrapping her coat about Nicola's shoulders. "Let the men take charge." Villemain had torn off his jacket and placed it over Claude's chest. He whispered to him and patted his cheek as if trying to revive him. "Bring him into the kitchen," said Nicola. Monsieur Villemain nodded. Several porters, clambering over one another, arranged themselves at Claude's head and feet, clumsily taking up his limbs. Claude cried out, agonized. His head lolled back, his body sagging. He clutched Villemain's arm. "No," he said, overhearing Nicola's instructions. "Take me to your house. I shall not set foot in my wife's apartments." He was alive. "It's your home. You're in shock," said Villemain. "Take me away. Take me away," begged Claude, trying to free himself of the hands on his limbs. "Please, dear cousin, don't fight. The physician is on his way." Villemain released his grip on Claude's shoulders. He motioned to Marthe and Nicola, speaking in a low whisper. "If you don't mind, I shall honour his request. We cannot risk further agitating him in this condition. Send the surgeon and the police to my apartment." "But we can set him on the kitchen table. There's plenty of room, good light. I shall have rags put down," protested Nicola, but her mind raced. What if Jean-Paul and his nurse were woken? What if they stumbled downstairs? What if Jean-Paul saw his father draw his last breath?
Come, pleaded Marthe, catching Nicola's gaze. Monsieur Villemin's right.
Nicola slumped into Marthe's embrace. She nodded.
Take him.
She did not know what to do. Should she go to Villemin's and wait for the police and surgeon to arrive? Should she send out a group of men to find her husband's assailants? Should she comfort Jean-Paul? She watched the porters carry Claude down the street, turning the corner. She knew she was not wanted, but could not stop herself. She hoisted the hem of her dressing gown in her hand, dug her feet more firmly into her slippers, and followed the solemn party. Marthe walked beside her. When they reached the entrance to Villemin's house, Nicola was stopped by a guard.
You're not to come in.
He's my husband, she hissed. Stand aside. The fellow stood in the entranceway, his legs apart, his arms held out. He moved to the scabbard slung from his belt and clutched his hands around the hilt of the dagger.
I have strict instructions.
Let me inside, said Nicola. She stepped close to the man, her eyes level with his, her lips curled in disgust.
I dare you to draw your blade.
She felt Marthe's hands on her shoulders. You're making it worse. Let's go home. I shall fix us both a drink. Villemin's staff will inform us of any changes. Claude! Nicola called into the darkness behind the guard. His hand remained on the hilt of his knife. Villemin! Let me inside! Monsieur Villemin appeared behind the guard and whispered something in his ear. The man glanced contemptuously at Nicola and moved his hand away from his weapon. He stood aside, allowing Villemin to pass. Villemin's brow furrowed. There was dried blood on the backs of his hands. He had taken off his coat and necktie.
Please, Nicola, leave him be. He's not himself. He's been attacked by street ruffians. He may not survive. He's lost much blood. I implore you, for the sake of peace, return to your apartments.
No! Shouted Nicola. She did not know what possessed her.
You cannot tell me what to do!
She began to hit her husband's cousin in the chest, landing several blows before Villemin's fingers gripped her wrists, holding her arms away from his body. She felt Marthe's hand on her back, heard her pleading that she calm herself. Oh, but she wanted to kick the stupid man. Villemin's eyes locked with hers, as if sensing that her fury would only be provoked by his fighting back. She held his gaze, startled into stillness when she realized that he was not angry. Rather, it seemed a sort of peace had overtaken him. She suddenly understood. There was nothing she could do but obey. She would return home and await the morning when there would be news.
This ends CD 2, CD 3.
Angelina, the 7th of April. Angelina lifted her lute down from its stand. Lise had just delivered the package of catgut strings ordered from Italy. She set to unwinding the clamps, carefully removing each old string and twisting it into a thin coil for disposal. The new strings glistened in their package, a faint smell of tanner's treatment lingering. But, like a dish that was an acquired taste, the mould surrounding a good cheese, the brine of fermented fish, the smell was welcomed. At St. Anne's, she used to sit beside Henrietta, plucking in tune to her friend's singing. How strange that the memory of her face was fading. She recalled her lips, her small white teeth, the flicker of her heavy eyelids, but could not arrange the picture into a face. Henrietta glimmered before her and disappeared. Her frock, her habit, her pretty feet hidden in the plain boots worn by the novices. Had Henrietta been a boy, her father might have permitted her to enroll in the music academy, for she came from a cultured and aristocratic family. He might have allowed her to receive tutoring, to hone her home-taught talents, become an accomplished musician even. But her refusal to follow the path of a docile and well-behaved maiden had infuriated her family to such an extent that they had cast her out into the cold embrace of the church. Angelina no longer felt like playing music. Lute strings waxed. She oiled the face and bowl of the instrument and returned it to its stand near her writing desk. She might as well start her day. Though used to dressing herself, she was patient as Lise laced her yellow smock and tied a sturdy belt at her waist. Her hair was hidden in a wrap, and thick stockings were rolled onto her legs, house slippers warming her feet. She washed her face and hands at the ewer, squinting at her complexion in a hand mirror. She looked wan and tired, as if she needed more sun. Maybe she should visit Deirdre, she thought, bring over a gift for her nieces, and inquire how her eldest sister was holding up in her confinement. Deirdre had always made an effort to bring the girls to see Angelina at St. Anne's on their birthdays and special feast days. Angelina had found their company immensely diverting, and never forgot to pluck them a bouquet of flowers from the garden she tended, or filch a little treat from the kitchen. Dressed, she hurried down the stairs to Marie-Catherine's second-floor chamber. "Good morning, Maman," she said, rubbing her hands along her arms. She must remember to bring a spare shawl when she went to work there. Marie-Catherine's office was almost as cold as the hallway. Her mother had been absorbed in her morning tasks and forgotten to ask Sophie to bank the fire. Although Angelina knew she should call the maid, it was easier to open the coal chest and deliver several black lumps to the fire herself. She glanced at the curtains, which were drawn closed, ignoring a flicker of resentment about Marie-Catherine's preference for low light. If it were her workplace, she would throw open the balcony doors to let in the morning sun, not to mention the sounds of the street life outside, enlivening the staid atmosphere of shelves and books and messy papers. "I have a surprise for you, Angie. I've invited Alphonse for morning tea," said Marie-Catherine. She sat behind her desk, surrounded by teetering books and empty inkwells, squinting at a letter. Surprised, Angelina steadied her voice. "I cannot receive a visitor dressed like this. Imagine if one of Madame Jasmine's daughters were to see me. May I return to my room and change?" "If you wish," replied Marie-Catherine, half listening. But in the hallway, Angelina bumped into Sophie, who had answered the front door, and was already leading Alphonse towards Marie-Catherine's chamber. She paused, unsure if she should finish her mission of changing outfits or if it were too late. Alphonse grinned, bowing deeply. Recovering, she mumbled an awkward good day, and he stepped forward and took her hand, pecking her on the knuckle. Despite her best efforts, she could not stop herself casting her eyes up and down his form, drinking in his pink stockings and buckled shoes, his dark blue velvet breeches, which matched his impeccable vest and doublet. Aware of her appraisal, Alphonse blushed to the roots of his hair. "Come," said Angelina, taking over from Sophie. "Let's bring you to Maman." Marie-Catherine rose from her chair, inching her way around her desk, then clutching the top of one of the chaises longues arranged on the circular rug before the fireplace. She waved her hand towards a small round table and chairs set before the balcony. "We're dining by the French doors for a change." As if cued somehow, Sophie rushed over, removing the cloth that had been placed over the table to reveal a plate of pastries, some sliced fruit, and an urn of steaming coffee. Perhaps Angelina had misjudged, the fading ambience of her mother's chamber. It was a workplace, after all. It made sense for function and practicality to reign, except during the monthly salon. Sophie was now pinning back the curtains. It seemed her mother had put careful thought into this meeting. Soon they were seated at the sunlit table, Sophie using a pair of silver tongs to deliver an eclair to each of their plates, adding a slice of pear and apple. Angelina felt suspicious. What game was Marie-Catherine playing at? She had better not be involving herself in her private affairs. That she be allowed to conduct her own friendships was one of the conditions she had demanded in agreeing to work as her mother's secretary. "Take this," said Alphonse, passing Angelina a napkin. She had dropped a blob of cream on her bodice. "Thank you," said Angelina. Now she was flushed. She glanced at Marie-Catherine, annoyed to see her scrutinizing their exchange, an expression of cool amusement in her eyes. Angelina studied Alphonse's small, soft fingers, ducking over the table to serve Marie-Catherine another slice of fruit, the lacy cuffs of his shirt inches from the cup of cream. It would give her much pleasure, she decided, most ungraciously, for him to slip. "I enjoyed the poem you sent," Angelina began. "In fact, I'm dressed like this because I stayed in late, trying to compose a reply, though I'm not quite satisfied." "Take your time," Alphonse smiled, affecting a nonchalant toss of his hand, resulting in his lacy cuff landing in the cream. Angelina smiled, sipping at a tiny cup of sweet coffee. Her victory was short-lived because Marie-Catherine had taken charge of the conversation, launching into a discussion of the story Alphonse had recited at the salon. He'd left the copy with her. She was appreciative of his reference to her tale, The Yellow Dwarf, in which the identity of a mischievous dwarf who has been enchanted by a fairy into a beautiful maiden is given away by a pair of hirsute feet. "It's perfectly amusing," said Alphonse. Angelina felt the old suspicion slide open its leathery eye, that she was merely an addendum to her mother's performances. Listening to Marie-Catherine's responses to Alphonse's story, she felt foolish. Her mother's reading was generous, designed to encourage him to keep developing the draft. He had not yet fully marked it with his own style, Marie-Catherine said gently. Angelina's criticism of the poem he'd sent seemed fierce and pointed by comparison. Thank the Lord she'd kept it to herself. She'd only wanted to impress him with her convent education. She recalled the jealousy she'd felt when Henrietta Dubois, after attending her first salon at St. Anne's, had knocked on the door of her room. She had a copy of the Conte des Fées in the pocket of her nightgown. "Do you have any idea how much I love your mother's fairy tales?" asked Henrietta, her green eyes shining. "Oh, Angelina, I suspect we shall be firm friends." She had moved her eyes towards the floor, tears welling. "St. Anne's is my death sentence, but perhaps we can make the time pass more quickly." Angelina, recovering from the shock of being visited in her bedroom at night, against the convent's strict regulations, had beckoned Henrietta to the chairs near the fireplace. "We can read a tale together, if you'd like." She was intimidated by the glamorous new novice, and felt slightly resentful that her mother's stories were the reason for the girl's interest. "Oh yes, let's. I thought perhaps if your mother visited, she might write a dedication on my copy, but this is a better idea. To hear her own daughter read to me, why, that would be heaven." Henrietta grasped Angelina's wrist. "What's it like to have a famous maman?" "I suppose it's rather wonderful," Angelina grumbled. Henrietta opened the small volume. "My family is so dull. Novels and stories are my only escape. My nurse used to read to me, but Maman got wind of it and had it stopped. She prefers me to absorb the lessons of the Psalms. It's been seasons since I was indulged with a fairy story. Might I select one? I've a favourite." Henrietta's eyes pleaded with Angelina. "Which is it?" "The Bluebird." "The Bluebird it shall be," said Angelina. It was a good choice. She had been observing Henrietta, on guard against the new novice's attempts to steal the floor at her salons, knowing instinctively that her charges would install the fascinating Henrietta as their new queen in a blink. Angelina had taken the small volume from Henrietta and started to read it in front of the fire. Since she knew the tale almost by heart, she was able to make a study of Henrietta as she recited the well-loved adventures of Princess Florine and her ugly stepsister, Tritonne, competing for the love of Prince Charming, who, attempting to escape a forced marriage to Tritonne, had angered the fairy Soussio and been turned into a bird for punishment. The attentive Prince Charming, in feathered guise, visited the princess in her tower in the evenings for satisfying conversations, fluttering away between the bars as dawn broke with pledges of undying devotion. Henrietta, for all her enthusiasm and spirit, appeared upset by the story. She curled the edge of her nightdress in her fist, listening avidly to every word. She had high cheekbones, a wide, friendly mouth, quick to pull into a smile or a pout, and attentive, expressive eyes. She was long-limbed, a doe in the woods, all arms and legs, a slender white neck. She had a cleft in her chin and the reddest, plumpest lips. Angelina, lost in her observations, soon realized she had read most of the story, a feat, as it was many pages long. When she glanced up, she saw that Henrietta was slipping off to sleep. She smiled. A good result. Marie-Catherine would be pleased, and closed the volume, placing it on the small table between the chairs. "Henrietta," she whispered, "you should go to bed." Henrietta stirred. Her cheeks were pink from the fire. "I'm so sorry. I shall have to arrange another escape. We must resume soon. Oh, Angelina, thank you." She stood, grabbing Angelina's hands, and, as if taking the position of the prince before he was transformed into a bird, drew Angelina's hands to her lips and kissed them fervently. "Shush," Angelina giggled. Feeling daring, she kissed Henrietta's hands in return. "You must be quiet. Hurry to your room." From that moment onwards, Angelina had kept her eyes and ears out for Henrietta as if her body were attuned, like her lute, to her friend's beautiful singing voice, to her every coming and going. She had been thawed, and because of the special attention Henrietta had commanded from her, surely her interest in her went beyond the fact of her famous mother. She had started noticing that some of Henrietta's beliefs and behaviours were very strange indeed. "Don't you agree, Angie?" asked Marie-Catherine. Angelina started. "Pardon me?" "I was telling Alphonse it's my duty to respond to talent," she replied. And in a segue all too familiar to Angelina, her mother began to recite the story of her rise to fame, how she wanted to be a writer since as far back as she could remember, how she read everything that she could get her hands on, how she wrote in solitude without a sliver of support, how she dreamed of success but never dared imagine its possibility, how Alphonse must believe in himself
ignoring detractors and staying true to his vision. You must be flexible. Try every form. Verse is all very well. She glanced at Angelina. But hardly a way to earn one's living. Unless the king takes an interest. But you'll have to court his favour, and that, dear boy, is a career in itself. Alphonse held on to Marie-Catherine's every utterance, spellbound. For this moment at least, he was a writer, and all the possibilities the world of letters might offer were spread before him like a summer sky. He admitted he'd had a story accepted by a small, well-respected journal. Marie-Catherine tapped the table. She asked whom he was reading, and when Alphonse replied that he was studying Charles Perrault's Tales of Mother Goose, she narrowed her eyes. You know, I have an immense argument with Monsieur Perrault. Granted, he is a supporter of the modern voice in French literature. Give me Molière or Lafayette over Racine and those stuffy old champions of the Hellenic spirit. But I take great exception to his opinion on the woman question. I'm not familiar with it, said Alphonse. Take my advice and don't waste your time. Marie-Catherine pressed a pastry into her mouth, chewing in annoyance. She swallowed. It's all there, in his fairy tales. He's only satisfied when his heroines are humiliated into submission. He celebrates the obedience of servants, scullions and kitchen slaves. His morals instruct young women that their true value is in being a humble and supplicant wife. Though, of course, I admire his powers of invention and have paid homage to him myself. His mouse-drawn carriages I especially like. You cannot imagine what frustration I feel at his view that women should have no agency, no intellectual life. Surely you cannot deny the genius of the little glass slipper? Asked Angelina, glancing at Alphonse in hope of agreement. He makes an excellent point about the situation of young women. His observations don't fall wide of the mark, though that's only my opinion. Marie-Catherine reached out a finger, touching Alphonse's sleeve. I trust you're not that kind of writer? Or gentleman? I promise to do my utmost to celebrate female heroinism, Alphonse replied, laughing. He winked at Angelina, and she smiled back in gratitude. Perhaps he wasn't an unthinking sycophant. Marie-Catherine gave a satisfied nod. She brightened. Go to the library, Angie, and find a copy of The Prince of Carency. I have a few spares. She turned to Alphonse, smiling. A gift. I cannot express my appreciation, replied Alphonse, clearly pleased to have won the prize of Marie-Catherine's special regard. Marie-Catherine ordered him to show her more of his work, and told him that she would be keeping an eye on his development. He showed a rare promise. You might write me too, should you feel inclined, teased Angelina, though I'm but a lowly reader. Marie-Catherine, the 7th of April. Nicola Tiquet, dressed in a black and white checkered skirt and jacket, was speaking to her liveried chair-bearers. She adjusted her stiff collar and pulled her shoulders straight. Lifting her skirt, she delicately stepped over a puddle. Marie-Catherine watched from above, as Nicola's beringed knuckles reached out to rap on her front door. She let the curtain drop, moving painfully towards the chaise to await Nicola's arrival in her chamber. Come in, she called from her seat near the fire in answer to Sophie's knock. Thank you for the note of warning.
Nicola swept her eyes across Marie-Catherine's writing desk, cluttered with empty glasses, spent quills, dried seals and piles of disorganized papers and accounts.
"Have you had company?"
She had spied the remains of morning tea set on the table under the window. Upon receiving Nicola's message, Marie-Catherine had invented the excuse of a horrid headache and sent Alphonse home, then given Angelina the remainder of the morning to herself.
"What are they saying about me?"
Nicola had removed a hand mirror from her pocketbook and was patting her curls. Sophie laid a tea tray on the table near the chaise longue. "Close the door on your way out, please," instructed Marie-Catherine. "We are not to be disturbed." She turned to Nicola, speaking in a low voice.
"All I can say is thank the Lord you've come to me. You can't go talking to all and sundry."
"Where's Jean-Paul? Is he well?"
"He's with his nurse,"
said Nicola, putting the mirror away. She began to fuss with the frilly cuffs of her sleeves.
"Come and sit down.
Have some tea." Nicola glanced up and met Marie-Catherine's eyes, held her gaze.
"We've all had a terrible fright."
"Well, of course you have. I'm uneasy about the situation, and you know the steely nerves I possess. How does Monsieur Tiquet fare?"
"He's recuperating at Monsieur Villemain's apartment."
Nicola lifted her narrow shoulders in a shrug.
"He refuses to come home."
Marie-Catherine poured 2 cups of tea. "If you want my counsel, you'll need to tell me exactly what happened." Nicola sat beside Marie-Catherine on the very edge of the chair, her purse in her lap, her back straight as a rod, as if at any moment she might rush from the chamber. "2 nights ago, I was playing Conquion with Matt. Claude permitted us to resume our weekly game. He was dining with Monsieur Villemain, as is his habit. It was growing late, and he hadn't returned home." Marie-Catherine frowned. "I don't understand. I thought you said he was locking you in." Nicola paused.
"Yes, well, he'd relented somewhat. He was still locking me up, but he allowed Marthe to join me some evenings. Claude and I had a fight over... well, it's of no consequence. The point is, he was meant to let Marthe out when he arrived home and then lock me in again. The brute is so particular he even sleeps with the key around his neck." She touched a finger to her brow. "But there was a shriek outside the window. A scuffle. Several cracks of pistol fire. Luckily, Jacques Mouet, the valet I told you about, my ally, he had a key made for me. I rushed into the street in my dressing gown. Someone put the lamp out so we didn't catch sight of the assailants." "You poor dear," whispered Marie-Catherine. Her whole body was tuned to Nicola's story. Her ears were pricked, her heart thrummed with each note of detail. "One of the pistol shots came close to piercing his heart. By the surgeon's account, he should have been killed, but fear contracted the organ, the man's very words, such that it shriveled inside its chamber, and he was spared. He was stabbed 5 times. Forgive me for asking, but is he to survive?" "It's too early to tell. He wouldn't let me stay at his side while he was attended. He insisted on being taken to Villemain's. I wasn't there when he made his statement to the police commissioner." "Why do you imagine he sent you away?" Nicola lowered her eyes. "I don't know how his mind turns." "Marie—" She looked up, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "I offered succour, but Villemain barred me from the grounds of his home. I returned to my apartments. Jean-Paul was woken by all the noise. It was a small comfort to bring him into my bed." Nicola blew her nose into her handkerchief. "The police commissioner asked Claude if he had any enemies, anyone fierce enough to make an attempt on his life, and his response was, hear this, I have none but my very own wife."
"And you had a witness to this conversation?" asked Marie-Catherine.
Nicola gave a weary smile. "My staff care more for me than my husband, and welcome any spare sou."
"Does Claude have enemies?"
"Only his creditors. He still runs debts." She tapped her fingers on her temples. "And, perhaps—"
She paused and briefly met Marie-Catherine's gaze.
"Jacques. Claude fired him several days ago."
Nicola pulled at a thread on her cuff and leaned forward, her voice dropping.
"You must understand, after your canny suggestion that I cease to dwell upon my marital disappointments, I took fortune into my own hands and wrote to Montgeorges."
"Do you think that was wise? It's not what I had in mind. I thought your affair had ended," said Marie-Catherine.
"Have you never taken a lover?" asked Nicola, her eyes once more filling with tears.
Marie-Catherine studied Nicola, her gaze narrowing. She did not answer the question.
"What did I have to lose?" Nicola continued. "I was bathing to prepare for Montgeorges' visit when Claude returned home early from dinner. He flew into a jealous rage and held my head under the water. Jacques had to drag him off me."
Marie-Catherine's eyes widened in shock. "This was your fight? Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry to hear that. What an awful fiend he is."
Nicola nodded fiercely. Her cheeks were flushed pink. "Claude has friends in the Parliament who'll protect him. They'll hang me for it."
"You mustn't imagine such things," admonished Marie-Catherine. "You need to keep calm and think your way through this very carefully. Tell me of this Jacques fellow. Where is he now? Can you have him brought in and questioned?"
"I shouldn't think so," said Nicola.
"Perhaps they shall blame him," said Marie-Catherine. "He has a grievance. Have you spoken with him since his dismissal?"
Nicola paused. "I have been avoiding him."
"But the fellow's loyal to you?"
"He always does my bidding."
"I urge you to find him, Nicola, for your own sake. The source of the attack lies with him."
"He has disappeared," Nicola sighed.
"What will you do?"
"I have an appointment at the patisserie this afternoon for Jean-Paul's birthday," said Nicola, defiant.
"And then?"
"Wait for Claude's recovery, I imagine," Nicola said after a pause. "Marie-Catherine, you know this path better than I. Do you think there's cause for concern?"
"I cannot say, but you do know I'm your friend. If they should accuse you, I'll do all in my power to assist you."
"Thank you," said Nicola, closing her eyes. "Though it doesn't give me solace. And I cannot imagine leaving my home if that's what you're going to suggest. I've been planning Jean-Paul's birthday party for months now."
"I was suggesting nothing of the sort. Come, my dear. We're not naive, friendless mesdames at the mercy of the state, but you must be cautious."
She did wish to help, though she was unsure how. Nicola was one of her oldest friends in the city. They had met when Marie-Catherine returned to Paris and was shopping for a publisher to place her first manuscript with. Nicola's father had amassed a fortune from his publishing house Carlier, and although it had long been sold into other hands, Nicola maintained connections at the firm. Although Marie-Catherine had eventually signed with the house of Claude Barbin, Nicola's introductions had been important for her early success. But it was more than that. They had confided in one another about their disappointing marriages, and their bond had grown deep. She owed Nicola a debt, and would see that it was repaid somehow,
though she could not really take in the dire turn in her friend's circumstances. She was still in a state of shock. The attack reminded her of one of the plots of her courtly novels. She checked the time on the mantelpiece clock. Her next visitor was due at any moment, and she must send Nicola on her way for both their sakes. After further words of reassurance, Marie-Catherine made a rare journey down the stairs, leaning on Sophie for support, to accompany Nicola to the front door. Her friend kept picking at her gloves, which were black, with a motif of dice sewn on the back. Despite her nervous fiddling, she insisted she felt much better, having unburdened herself of her cares. Kissing Nicola goodbye, Marie-Catherine watched her settle into the chair of her bright red palanquin. Nicola dangled a blue handkerchief from the window, which Marie-Catherine answered with a small wave. The liveried chair-bearers hoisted the long handles of the transport onto their hips and set off down Rue Saint-Benoît, disappearing around a corner as they turned into the busy Rue Saint-Germain. She had seen Nicola off in the nick of time, for Marguerite de Noailles was marching towards her at a courier boy's pace, her black cape billowing in the light breeze. Marguerite recommended travelling the city by foot, insisting that walking long distances helped her to arrange her thoughts. If ever there was a moment Marie-Catherine might be willing to test her friend's theory, it was then and there, if only her feet could support the task. Inside with her guest, Marie-Catherine called Sophie to make a pot of coffee. Returning to her office, she invited Marguerite to be seated before the fireplace, where her friend wasted no time in bringing up the business she wished to discuss with Marie-Catherine. "Might you read a little?" asked Marguerite, passing her several pieces of paper. She was prone to lung infections, and always left her house coiled in layers of knitted shawl, which she now began to remove, wrap by meticulous wrap. At the salon, Marie-Catherine recalled making a promise to cast her eye over an article Marguerite was writing for a political broadsheet, and to advise her friend about whether it was ready to submit to a publisher. "I've been experimenting with a new idea," began Marguerite. "I want to write a book arranged as a series of letters from a woman living in Paris to her friend in the provinces. They swap stories, news, gossip. It's informative and entertaining, and I think there's an audience for it. I wondered, might I circulate one of the letters at our next salon?" "It sounds fascinating," smiled Marie-Catherine. "And if you're given insightful suggestions, then why not?" Marie-Catherine turned the pages, a hand resting on her chin. Her friend was talented, shrewd, and tenacious. It was only a matter of time before she found success. "You've made a clever choice, reporting on the trial of Madame de la Pivardière for the murder of her husband. Fancy that, the fellow returning after all those years professing to be her deceased spouse. It shall cause a sensation. You'll have no trouble selling it." They began to speak of who they might invite to next month's salon. Marie-Catherine could see that her friend was distracted, toying with her hair and lapsing into silences. She felt rather similar herself. Sophie brought in a tray of bread and cheese, which they shared, but it was no help. They exchanged a glance, sighing. "I had a good talking to myself," confessed Marguerite, "and decided I wouldn't bring up Madame Tiquet. But I cannot concentrate." She leaned forward in her chair. "What are your thoughts? Have you any inclination to share?" "Only that I'm desperate to find a way to assist her." Marie-Catherine concentrated on reaching for a piece of bread, avoiding Marguerite's eyes. "Yes, I know how attached you are to her. She seemed distressed at the salon." "She worked herself into a state over a prediction from a fortune-teller," offered Marie-Catherine, her voice deliberately flippant. She had not missed the glint of storyteller's interest in her friend's eyes. Amongst her writing circle, Marguerite was the colleague Marie-Catherine trusted most, but still, it would not do to reveal Nicola's secrets. Descended from the nobility, Marguerite's family fortune had dwindled over the past several generations, and, like Marie-Catherine, she had taken to scrutinizing her accounts. Unlike the penny-pinching authors, Nicola had inherited a fortune of 500,000 livres upon the death of her publishing magnate father. She issued from new money, not a drop of aristocracy in her veins, and conducted herself as if she wished to disperse the family coin as quickly as possible. At times, Marie-Catherine was terribly envious of Nicola's financial freedom. And no doubt Marguerite was too. Nicola did not have to write for a living, and had little idea of the financial constraints facing the authors who frequented Marie-Catherine's salons. Marguerite waited, and, when Marie-Catherine was not forthcoming with further details, proclaimed Nicola Tiquet a desperately unhappy woman. "Do you recall the trial of Madame Marie de Brinvilliers?" "Of course. Had I a stronger stomach, I might have written a novel about it." Marie-Catherine let out a slow breath. "Already Nicola imagines she'll be blamed." She had not been able to attend the public execution of Madame de Brinvilliers, though she had followed the case in the newspapers. But she was lying when she claimed she might write a story about the case. At the time, she would not have dared, no matter how much the events intrigued her. Madame de Brinvilliers had been found guilty of conspiring with her lover, the Chevalier de Sainte-Croix, to poison her father and 2 of her brothers in order to inherit their estates. Marie-Catherine was one of the few who publicly objected to the spectacle of a woman beheaded and then burned at the stake. Most of the city's inhabitants, whatever their rank, dressed in their finest and gathered in the town square to witness the punishment of the notorious female criminal. De Brinvilliers had been exposed following the death of de Sainte-Croix, who had left in his possession a red leather box with instructions to have it opened upon his demise. Inside were diaries and letters exposing the pair's methods of obtaining and preparing the poison aqua tofana, a potent mix of belladonna, arsenic and lead, which Madame de Brinvilliers had tested for effectiveness on patients at a city hospital she liked to visit. The notorious Madame was promptly arrested and tried, then tortured by being forced to drink 16 pints of water. Finally, she was beheaded and burned. The criminal scandal drew attention to the suspicious deaths of several prominent persons, and Louis XIV, in fear of being targeted himself, launched the Affair of the Poisons, headed by his meticulous lieutenant criminal, Nicolas de la Reynie, to arrest and interrogate the city's poisoners and witches and their customers. The whole affair lasted 5 years and reached into the highest royal circles, all the way to the king's bedroom and his mistress, Madame de Montespan. By the conclusion of the lengthy investigation, 36 people had been publicly executed. Perhaps, Marie-Catherine wondered, she might have benefited from witnessing the execution of Madame de Brinvilliers, and yet she shuddered at the thought. She considered her idea to pen a story about a modern Parisian woman. Might she invent a protagonist like de Brinvilliers? It would make a page-turning story, certainly, but it was dangerous ground. There were few things the palace liked less than a violent woman, something Nicola was no doubt beginning to learn. What if Paris grows thirsty again to make an example of a woman for crimes against a man? Asked Marie-Catherine. Neither king nor church care for the suffering of our sex, Marguerite replied. Will you help, Nicola, if events take a turn. Oh, I shall be first in line, promised Marguerite, reaching for her bundle of shawls. She tossed the garment over her back, knotting it with the expertise of one accustomed to getting by without a maid. Perhaps we're allowing our imaginings to carry us away. I'm sure things will settle down. Nicola's too wealthy for her reputation to be tarnished by such a charge. Her husband will come to his senses and drop his gripe, take the path of least resistance. He would be mad to pursue her in the courts. Isn't he a virtual pauper? What a relief to have the advice of her practical friend. She always set her straight. If she didn't mind her thoughts, Marie-Catherine would become further entangled in a drama that had the potential to cost her dearly. Seated back on the chaise, having seen Marguerite off, Marie-Catherine glanced at the cups and saucers on the table before the fireplace. She took in her writing desk, pressed against the opposite wall, its clutter of papers and ink bottles, dim and uninviting. Perhaps she should jot down notes for her new story idea in her bedchamber. She called Sophie and asked her to transfer her writing materials onto a tray. She went to her bedchamber and had the maid remove her stays, rolling another set of stockings over her feet. She asked for a bolster at her back, her legs raised up on pillows. "I'm not to be disturbed," she instructed as she settled into her position on the bed. Although Angelina had made it clear that she was eager to help, her thoughts were too muddled and new to be shared. She would gather them onto the page in private. She had written The Prince of Carency in this very position, snuggled up in bed during a particularly cold winter. She had been so taken with the work that many hours would pass by without her awareness. Whenever she finally glanced up to peep into the apartments across the street, she would realize that the light had changed. If it worked then, there was no reason to believe it would not work now. She considered her new idea. Her protagonist would have to be high-ranked and involved in a loveless marriage. The notion reminded her of Nicola, and she laid down her quill. Her friend's fears were not unreasonable. There was every possibility that she would be questioned by the authorities about any involvement in her husband's attack. If the absolute worst eventuated, Nicola might be arrested. Marie-Catherine shrugged off the notion. Nicola would be protected by her fortune, and yet people's minds would travel. Gossiping neighbours, the law, her acquaintances and friends. She turned over the page in her notebook and began to make a list of acquaintances whom she might call upon to help Nicola if necessary. Satisfied that she had made progress towards helping her friend's case, she turned back to her writing notes. But the urge to develop her new idea had gone, and for once she didn't feel the stabbing guilt at giving in to her writing slump. It was almost a relief to have another problem taking shape in her thoughts. Marie-Catherine slept poorly that night, imagining scenes from Claude's attack. When she arose the following morning, Nicola's plight was still on her mind. She sent Sophie to collect the city broadsheets as soon as they went on sale. She asked for both the Paris and Amsterdam editions of the newspapers. Enough time had passed for the salacious news to have reached the Dutch papers and for them to be printed and transported to France. It was always useful to get a perspective that was not subject to Louis XIV's censorship. Scanning the headlines, she felt her breath catch. Printed on the front page of the City Chronicle was a blow-by-blow account of the attack on Claude Tiquet. It was just as Nicola had told her. He'd been stabbed 5 times by an unknown assailant who had also fired several pistol shots before fleeing on foot. The Grand Chamber deputed an adviser to go to Tiquet and assured him, on part of the Parliament, that he had nothing to do but to put his mind to rest, that nothing would be wanting to him and that his case would be vigorously pursued. The city police had spoken to several persons of interest, with suspicion fallen upon Monsieur Tiquet's wife, Madame Nicolas Carlier Tiquet, of the Carlier publishing fortune. The essence of this reportage was repeated in the 4 broadsheets Marie-Catherine read. However, in the Histoire Journalière, a tabloid released under an imprint of Cornelius Alberts, the authors, de Dangeau and de Sourches, noted in their closing paragraph that nobody suspected the King's Guard, Monsieur Gilbert Montgeorges, Madame Tiquet's alleged long-term lover, of involvement in the failed murder attempt. A chill passed through Marie-Catherine. It was a bold move to publish such speculation. All Paris might know of Nicola's love affair, but that was hardly an unusual course for a woman in her position. In suspicious minds, a motive for Nicola to have her husband disposed of perhaps already existed, but now it was printed in the newspapers for anyone to read. The morning's news brought Nicola's vulnerabilities into sharp relief. She was in imminent danger. If anyone in the city knew how swiftly the tide of public opinion could turn, it was Marie-Catherine. It was only a matter of time before Nicola began to face serious difficulty. Perhaps it would be best if Nicola left Paris for a little while, bought herself some distance. The parish of Saint-Sulpice was a short palanquin ride from Marie-Catherine's apartments. She had not visited the cathedral, one of the largest in Paris, with its fluted ceilings and carved saints' alcoves, in many years. It had been her custom to travel out of the city during feast days, to attend the services held at St. Anne's and to visit Angelina. But of late her observance of her faith had been as ill-disciplined as her writing. She slipped between the cathedral's enormous oak double doors. Pausing at the scallop-shaped basin of holy water inside the entranceway, she made a slow sign of the cross. The cathedral was empty, chairs laid out for afternoon mass. Frankincense lingered in the air, the atmosphere dark, though occasional candles burned in the chapels of the saints. A heavy-set woman carrying a basket was changing candles before the shrine to St. Joseph. Marie-Catherine moved over to the woman, fingers clutched tightly around her cane. "Is Father Etienne still here?" The woman gazed at her with small dark eyes. "Yes, madame, I think he's in his office. Shall I fetch him for you?" Marie-Catherine nodded. She watched the woman shuffle along the black and white tiled floor. Overcome with nameless guilt, she stood before a statue of St. Francis. His hands were clasped at his chest, his head tilted to the heavens, and a dove had settled on one brown-robed shoulder. "You asked to speak to a priest?" inquired a voice. Marie-Catherine shifted her cane to her other hand, leaning heavily on it for support. She stepped down from the alcove into the shadowy aisle. "Father Etienne?" The priest standing before her, hands tucked into the sleeves of his black cassock, resembled her old friend in many ways. His hair was now grey, closely cropped in the familiar style. His eyes were as warm as ever, though there were crow's feet at the edges and lines running alongside his jowls. His lips were pink, his nose straight, and his figure slight, even more so than previously, as if a lifetime of bearing the sins and secrets of his congregation had caught up with him somehow. "May I make a confession?" suggested Marie-Catherine. Acknowledging her lax faith had not been her intention, but she was unsure how to broach her proposal. Father Etienne seemed amused. "By all means." He opened the door to the confessional in St. Francis's chapel, holding out his palm and inviting her to step inside. Tiny shafts of light poured through the holes in the grille. She could not kneel, and so had to stand, hunched uncomfortably, her hands clasped over her belly. She felt foolish. Too many thoughts crowded her mind. Where to begin?
Take your time,
prompted Father Etienne. It was no use. This is a mistake. Forgive the interruption. She pushed open the door, blinking as she stepped back into the cathedral's dim light. Father Etienne came to stand patiently beside her.
Shall we take a turn in the garden? It's peaceful this time of day. I can pick some of my roses for you.
Only if I might lean on you. I have an affliction. She broke off, avoiding the priest's eyes. Father Etienne nodded. I'm a little... She rushed on, waving her fingers at her throat. It's a little stifling in here. I can't hear my thoughts. Pressing on her cane, she moved closer to Father Etienne, exiting the cathedral and shuffling along its stone buttressed side, to the garden and graveyard at the back. She understood immediately why he had suggested taking a walk. Recognizing the trio of elm trees planted in an intimidating row, black branches budding with soft new growth, she drew in a deep breath and closed her eyes. The elm's branches seemed to gather the graves below into a protective embrace. Side by side were the tombs of her firstborn, a son, delivered the year she turned 16, and her firstborn daughter, arrived not long after her 17th birthday. Each infant had been permitted to draw less than a moon cycle's breath. She had not planned to visit the graves of her children, preferring to associate their memory with places other than the desolate parish cemetery. But the priest had a knack of intuiting the needs of his parishioners and friends before they realized that they existed. The notion must have kindled to life in some secret place beyond her awareness. Father Etienne had taken a pair of shears from his robe and cut 2 perfect white roses from the bushes. You pricked your finger, she noted, accepting the flowers. She stopped herself from touching the droplets of blood formed on the priest's thumb.
I'll leave you a moment, he said.
Leaning over the tombstones to read the inscriptions she had ordered from the stonemason, she muttered a prayer, laying 1 rose on each tiny grave. The memories of her children's unmoving bodies had not dimmed in the intervening years. I have a small problem, said Marie-Catherine when she joined Father Etienne on the path.
I deduced as much.
Buying time, Marie-Catherine brightened. Angelina's left St. Anne's. She's adjusting to Paris, if a little slowly. Father Etienne asked why she had withdrawn from the cloister. Flustered, Marie-Catherine concealed her selfishness and ventured that her daughter's vocation had wavered. She was a lively girl. She's sharp, never hesitates to give me her opinion, which is always different from the one I profess. It's good to be challenged in my ways.
And Deirdre and Teresa?
They're married, busy with their lives. Marie-Catherine stopped, turning to face Father Etienne. I've a request. It involves a dear friend. I thought we might put our heads together, like old times. In a rush of words, the story of Nicolas Tiquet's predicament poured out, as well as Marie-Catherine's fears that her friend would be arrested, thrown into prison, tried and blamed, made to suffer for the attack on her husband. She had tossed about in bed all night, trying to think of how she might intervene. She asked Father Etienne if he'd read about the case in the newspapers. He replied that he had, and that he knew Madame Tiquet, though only a little, for she often attended Mass.
Unlike yourself, he teased.
Can I be blamed? Protested Marie-Catherine. There's too much pain here.
Of course not, said Father Etienne, gentle-voiced. There's no need to bristle. I'm on your side.
Marie-Catherine leaned on Father Etienne's arm. I have thought it all through. I think the best course is for her to leave Paris until everything settles. Her servants need not know of it. I can arrange a sedan chair and then a carriage to meet her on the outskirts of the city. I'm not sure where to send her. I'm sure she'll have her own thoughts, but I wondered if you might be the one to convince her. You are persuasive. Why not let the law take its course? She heard the change in his voice, the mask of social convention slipping. You know exactly why, she replied, searching his eyes. Please, you must help me. Do not have me beg. All you need do is visit her for tea, have a simple conversation. I shall take care of the rest. Simply tell her that you've come from me. She will understand. She must. Father Etienne sighed. Leave it with me. Though you understand, I do not know her well. When do you want the meeting organized? Marie-Catherine closed her eyes. Soon. I fear it'll be a mistake not to act. What if she's arrested? If we find her refuge, she can plan her next move. As far as I'm aware, money is no concern. Father Etienne must come through. Speaking her plan aloud convinced her it was the right decision. There was a queer rumble in her mind, like a crackle of thunder inside a distant cloud. A tempest rolled towards her, gathering in strength, and she did not wish to be pummeled by its fury. Nicolas, the 18th of April. Jean-Paul was small for his age, with dark brown hair and eyes the colour of a troubled sea. Moving his bottom onto the high back chair, inching backwards like an encumbered hermit crab, so his legs dangled over the edge, he put his hands in his lap and slumped forward. His nurse had fastened the buttons of his brown velvet waistcoat, adding a fresh collar and laced cravat, secured with a pin in the shape of a lion, his favourite animal. The family dinner was always served in the middle of the day and formal attire observed. Not even Jean-Paul was excused from a change of clothes, a rough wash and a brushing of his lovely curls. Instead of Monsieur Tiquet, Marthe de Senonville headed the dining table, her hat and coat hooked on the stand in the entranceway. She had arrived late, occupied all morning with errands. She apologized, flustered, and lowered herself into her seat, professing an inordinate hunger. At present she was holding a crystal goblet up to the light from the chandelier, letting the flickers of candle flame enhance the clear lemon of the Teutonic wine. "Tell me your opinion," said Nicolas. "I've ordered a crate for Jean-Paul's party." She dug her son's silver fork into his buttered asparagus and beckoned him to move his chin closer to his plate, so as not to spill food on the floor. He opened his pouty lips in a state of resistance, confronted with the necessity of eating rather than any natural turn of his face, and with his teeth almost closed together took a nibble of the vegetable's wheat-like head. "Eat!" hissed Nicolas. "I'm not in the mood for games." With his father absent, Jean-Paul's behaviour had become excessively childish. He shut his mouth, raising his long-lashed eyes to defy Nicolas's pleading gaze. He was taking advantage of his mother's softness, behaving as if he had all the time in the world to finish his meal, for Claude was not there to reprimand him, bringing his fist down upon the table, causing them all to start. Platters of roast beef, peas, bread, cheese, a dish of onions were laid out on the table. Before the great chairs, before Nicolas and Jean-Paul, who sat side by side, roared the fire. "It is lovely, crisp, not too dry." Madame de Senonville put her glass down and leaned forward in the chair. "Please do not take this as a criticism." She drew in a breath, treading carefully. "But are you not going too far?" Nicolas covered her son's ears, mock outrage rippling across her face.
Nothing's too much for Jean-Paul. You only turn 8 once, don't you, darling?
She moved her hands to her son's shoulders and kissed his nose.
Yes, Maman,
said Jean-Paul, closing his eyes and moving closer to Nicola.
Eat your meat,
said Nicola, taking advantage of his distractedness and popping a forkful into his mouth.
Mesdames Charlotte and Louise have advised they cannot attend. I'd not heard. Are you sure? We shall miss the girls, won't we, Jean-Paul?
But her son had turned his attention to sculpting his peas and gravy into a row of soldiers about to breach a rather muddy moat.
I can confirm for you. The Mullenix family are occupied. They have a fair to visit. The heifers from their estate are being sold at market. Very well, said Nicola, swallowing a mouthful of wine. There are others to fill their places.
Jean-Paul was dipping his fingers into his gravy and trying to write his name on his plate.
Stop it, please,
said Nicola. Glancing guiltily at his mother, Jean-Paul pulled back his hand, catching the side of his special mug, which overturned, the contents dripping over the tablecloth. Marthe made busy with her beef, slicing a perfect sliver, which she dipped in gravy and popped into her mouth, closing her eyes to savour the rich flavour. Nicola rang the bell for the nurse, and when the woman arrived slightly out of breath, Nicola instructed her to return Jean-Paul to the nursery. She would have his tutor begin the afternoon lessons early.
Maman,
her son whined, fat tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Nicola leaned over to peck his cheek.
There. I'll be in to read with you just as soon as I'm finished.
But Jean-Paul was not comforted. Nurse had to use a strong, tenacious grip to remove his clinging fingers from their grasp on the back of his chair. He was eventually prized free, and, after Nicola blew him a kiss, disappeared down the hallway, his hand firmly clasped in his nurse's, her large bottom wobbling around the corner.
I've not seen him like this, remarked Marthe. I know.
Nicola dabbed at her lips with a serviette.
He's confused. He pines for his father. I've had a day, Nicola protested, refusing to be drawn on the topic. I obtained funds from my banker, a little insurance. I tried writing to Montgeorges, though I was unable to set my thoughts on paper with much sense. Claude shows improvement. I'm informed he's up and about.
How can you speak of your husband and lover in the same breath?
My husband has no need of me. Villemain sees to him, said Nicola, affecting a dismissive air. Tomorrow I'm having my hair curled, in preparation for Jean-Paul's special day. My orders are with the caterers. I have a puppeteer booked, and a fellow to give lessons in throwing hoops. A game of croquet. The afternoon will be on everyone's lips.
Marthe settled back in her chair. I'm pleased you've taken your mind off your troubles. I don't know how you manage. Nicola asked the maid to refill her glass.
More?
She pointed to the carafe, raising her brows at Marthe. At the back of her mind the truth hummed uncomfortably. She would not let Marthe see her fear.
I have an appointment this afternoon. I'd best keep my wits.
I hoped you might keep me company a little longer,
Nicola whispered. She glanced at the portrait of Clotilde, a fine rendering, painted by the renowned Clotilde, sitting on a swing, dangling from a great oak tree, her legs kicked out, her hair in ribbons. Nicola brought the goblet to her mouth, drinking deeply.
Perhaps you've taken enough wine?
Perhaps, Nicola shrugged. Behind the facade, underneath her skin, she was aware of a looming dread. It had increased in size during the past week, boundless, like some spreading abomination drawn out of the sea, sending its feelers throughout her body. She did her best to ignore it, distracting herself by picturing her grand dining room denuded of its finery. She'd been considering transporting the more precious items to her private chambers. The large mirror above the fireplace, her Roman tapestry, the Turkish carpet lain over the sideboard, perhaps even the chandelier that shimmered above the long table. When Claude was well again, he would come sniffing around, demanding his share of their possessions. She did not expect him to resume living in the same house. Their marriage was broken beyond repair. She recalled the visit by Saint-Sulpice's parish priest, Father Etienne, several days ago. He claimed to have been sent by Marie-Catherine, and had hired a carriage, insisted that she rouse Jean-Paul and pack a valise. They wanted to take her out of Paris, where she would be safe, he explained. But she had turned him down. It seemed too great a risk. The second she was gone, Claude would no doubt move back into their house, seal the doors and change all the locks. For all she knew, it was a ruse arranged by Claude himself. What did Marie-Catherine know of this priest, after all? On top of her distrust was disappointment. Her maid had snuck the priest into her room, disguised as a Thetian monk, and when she first heard his whispered voice, she had thought he was Montgeorges, come to help her. A false hope had risen in her heart that was soon dashed. Perhaps if it had been her lover visiting, she might have accepted the offer. With a prick of nostalgia, she recalled her first meeting with Gilbert. Her brother, Matthias Carlier, was a soldier in the King's Guard, and, using his connections at the Palace of Versailles, had arranged for her to attend a theatre production. She remembered the Hall of Mirrors, the primped and formal courtiers. The play was performed in the gardens, with moving sets, an extravagant fountain display and fireworks. When his formal duties had concluded, Matthias sought her out, asking if she was impressed. "This is too much," she had replied, squeezing his hand. Gilbert stood next to Matthias. The men gleamed in their polished uniforms. "I'd like you to meet my dear friend, Monsieur Montgeorges," Matthias said. What control and forbearing her brother's companion held himself with. He was tall, with light brown hair and alert green eyes. Her brother was perhaps more handsome, but Monsieur Montgeorges had an air of mystery about him. Although he spoke little, his eyes barely left her face for the rest of the evening. He was naive, she recalled thinking. He did not know how to hide his attraction towards her. She found it endearing. She had passed the evening laughing, delighting at the pomp and splendour, a fairy tale evening at Versailles at the King's pleasure. A few weeks later, she had received a letter from her brother's friend, asking if she might correspond with him. She had been shocked, and then delighted, pressing the letter to her cheek and kissing it many times. Their flirtation had begun. They wrote weekly, exchanging gossip, quoting lines from poems, sharing tender endearments. She felt grateful to her brother, who was aware of the cracks in her marriage, and had sent her this charming fellow as a diversion. Their correspondence brought her immense comfort. When the King's Guard was stationed in Paris, she would sneak out to the opera or theatre with them. It was a secret imaginary life, one that sustained her, keeping her from expressing her bitterness towards her husband, for his many betrayals. Unlike Claude, Gilbert was kind, considerate and stalwart. And, unlike her commoner husband, his background was aristocratic. He responded with careful consideration to her troubles. Always he advised her to count her blessings, to remember to face the world with a full heart. The blast of a trumpet sounded from the street outside, and Nicola sat up in her chair, the hairs on her arms rising. "What's all the fanfare?" "A procession," ventured Marthe. Open the curtains, Nicola commanded, digging her feet under the table to locate her shoes. She had slipped them off. She stood and moved to the window. Outside, she saw a squadron of police, some 50 men marching up the street, their blue jackets crisscrossed with leather belts, right hands on their scabbards, the feathers of their tricorn hats bobbing in unison. The Commissioner of Police rode in front, in an open-topped carriage, the door emblazoned with the crest of the city. The profusely sweating horses trotted in all directions, giving the driver the devil's trouble. Marta's fingers squeezed Nicola's shoulder. A serviette was tucked into her palm, the wineglass set back on the table. "Wipe your lips," she whispered. "It's me," whispered Nicola, turning to catch Marta's eyes. "They've come for me." She should have listened to the priest, but that was ridiculous. No, it must be something else. Perhaps an execution was scheduled, and in her distracted state she'd forgotten to read the news. A loud clanging sounded at the gates. "Answer the door," Nicola instructed her maid. She gathered her shawl about her shoulders. Why had she declined Father Etienne's offer to ferry her beyond the gates of Paris? She had been a fool. Marta followed the maid down the stairs to the entranceway, then returned with quickened steps. "He's puffed up like a leather ball," she warned. Nicola listened to the sound of boots on the stairs, and she felt as if she were remembering a bad dream. The Chief Lieutenant of Police entered the dining room. A pair of guards, vile pikes nearly scraping the doorway, stood on either side of him. He needed the support, for Lieutenant Lapin was short, shorter than Nicola, with brushed curls falling to his shoulders. His figure was lean, as if he observed frugal habits. Nicola knew his hands, the rake of his touch. Many years earlier, when she had been utterly desperate, battling Claude's iron will, she had corresponded with the lieutenant. Determined to win the argument with her husband, she had invited the police commissioner to her salon for a drink. They had too much cognac, and she had permitted herself an indiscretion. Eager to secure the separation of her fortune from that of her spendthrift husband, she had overplayed her hand.
This ends CD 3.